Hello and thank you for joining for today's cryptid horror stories. The first story today is about the Ropen, a controversial cryptid from Papua New Guinea and the surrounding Southwest Pacific. It is most notoriously described as a living, pterosaur-like flying reptile that is nocturnal, exhibits bioluminescence emitting a glowing light while flying, and features a long, flanged tail. A team of disgraced paleontologists and a local guide traveled to a remote region of Papua New Guinea to prove the existence of the Rhamphorhynchoid. To attract the creature, they discover a local taboo. The second story today is about the Kikiyaon, is a terrifying, owl-like cryptid from West African folklore. Often described as a soul cannibal or soul eater, it is a man-sized creature that blends human and avian traits. It is known for its foul, rotting stench and deadly predatory nature. A group of wealthy amateurs embark on an adventure they were not equipped to survive in the African jungle. And what they find deep in the jungle, money can't save you. In the description below, the stories have been timestamped if you would like to skip to the second story. And now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Neon Grave. The limestone crevice smelled of wet stone and ancient decay, a mineral tang that coated the back of the throat like powdered bone dissolved in rainwater. Zach pressed his spine against the cold rock wall, feeling the uneven texture of fossilized coral and calcite deposits digging through his sweat-soaked shirt into his skin. His lungs burned, each breath a shallow, desperate sip of air that tasted of iron and fear. Beside him, Sarah trembled, her knees drawn up to her chest, her boots sliding in the thin layer of mud that had accumulated at the bottom of the fissure. They had been running for what felt like hours, though time had become a liquid thing in the darkness, stretching and compressing with each thunderous heartbeat. "You shouldn't have done it," Zach whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own ragged breathing. The words came out in a hiss, sharp and accusatory, cutting through the humid darkness of the cave. "I told you, Sarah. I fucking told you to leave the body alone." Sarah's eyes gleamed in the dimness, wide and white with terror. Her face was streaked with mud and tears, a mask of desperation and defiance. "He was just lying there," she shot back, her voice cracking but fierce. "In the open casket, exposed. What was I supposed to do, Zach? Just let him rot there while we desecrated his grave." "You weren't supposed to touch anything." Zach's hand shot out, gripping her shoulder with fingers that dug in too hard. "Dr. Vance said the resins were the bait. The taboo wasn't about respect, Sarah. It was a warning, a biological warning. The Ropen is attracted to those specific preservatives, and you." A sound cut through his words, stopping them dead in his throat. It came from somewhere above them, beyond the jagged ceiling of the crevice, beyond the canopy of ancient trees and liana vines that choked the sky. A rhythmic clicking, like the dry snap of massive insect mandibles, or the sound of enormous talons tapping against hollow bone. Click, 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 click. The pattern was deliberate, almost musical in its precision, and it echoed through the limestone passages with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in Zach's molars. Sarah went rigid. Her breath stopped entirely, her chest frozen in a half-inhalation. Slowly, so slowly it seemed to take an eternity, she tilted her head upward, staring at the narrow strip of visible sky through the crack in the earth above them. Her lips moved in a silent prayer, or perhaps a curse. Then the glow began. It started as a faint suggestion of color, a barely perceptible shift in the darkness of the cave walls. The wet limestone began to shimmer with an unnatural hue, a sickly, pulsing neon green that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. The light waxed and waned in perfect synchrony with the clicking sound above, brightening with each click, dimming in the silences between. The reflection danced across the pooled water at their feet, turning the shallow puddles into mirrors of radioactive emerald. And Zach felt his stomach twist with a primal, cellular horror that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with the ancient instincts of prey recognizing predator. It's found us, Sarah breathed, the words barely a movement of her lips. Zack didn't answer. He was staring at the walls, watching the green light paint the fossilized shells and ancient coral in shades of impossible luminescence, remembering how they had arrived at this moment, the culmination of greed, hubris, and the theft of bones. 3 weeks earlier, the expedition had seemed like salvation. Dr. Zachary Halloway, once a promising paleontologist at the University of Queensland, now a disgraced academic clinging to the fringes of respectability, had received an email that promised redemption. The message came from Dr. Marcus Vance, a former colleague whose career had similarly imploded after the fabrication scandal of 2019. Vance had been working in the remote highlands of Papua New Guinea, chasing rumors that had persisted for centuries among the indigenous populations. The Ropen, the demon flyer, the creature that hunted by night and carried the souls of the dead to the mountain peaks. Not a pterosaur, Vance had said during their first meeting in a cramped Port Moresby hotel room, his eyes burning with the fervor of a convert. Everyone makes that mistake. The Ropen isn't a fossil, it's alive. It's been alive for millions of years, evolving in parallel, filling a niche that nothing else has been able to fill, and I know how to prove it. The team Vance had assembled was a collection of academic outcasts and desperate believers. There was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a paleobiologist who had lost her tenure after publishing a paper suggesting that pterosaur flight mechanics were far more sophisticated than the orthodox models allowed. There was James "Jimmy" Park, a brilliant but unstable graduate student who had been expelled from 3 universities for unauthorized field experiments. And there was Sarah Chen, a cultural anthropologist whose career had stalled after she had become too enamored with what her colleagues dismissively called cryptid ethnography, the study of indigenous legends not as folklore, but as historical accounts of genuine encounters with unknown species. Vance had hired a local guide through a network of contacts in the capital, a weathered man named Tobin who spoke 4 languages, and whose face bore the scars of a lifetime navigating the treacherous jungle trails of the interior. Tobin had listened to their plan with an expression of mounting horror, and when Vance had explained that they intended to search for the Ropen in the remote limestone karst region near the border of the western province, the guide had shaken his head slowly, deliberately, with the gravity of a man pronouncing a death sentence. "You do not find the Ropen," Tobin had said, his voice low and gravelly. "The Ropen finds you, and it only finds those who disturb the dead." Vance had laughed, dismissing the warning as superstitious nonsense, but Sarah had leaned forward, her anthropological instincts piqued. Over the next 2 days, as they prepared their equipment and secured passage on a dilapidated cargo plane that would take them to the last airstrip before the true wilderness, Sarah had interviewed Tobin extensively, documenting his stories with the meticulous care of a scholar preserving a dying language. The Ropen, according to Tobin and the elders he had spoken with, was not merely a predator. It was a guardian of sorts, a creature that patrolled the boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors. It was drawn to specific locations, sacred burial sites where the ancient peoples had used rare preservative resins derived from the sap of the kauri tree and the secretions of certain cave-dwelling beetles. These resins, mixed with powdered limestone and the ashes of sacred fires, had been used for millennia to prepare the bodies of chiefs and holy men for their journey to the afterlife. The mixture produced a scent, Tobin explained, a chemical signature that human noses could barely detect, but which acted as a beacon to the creatures that ruled the night sky. The old people knew, Tobin had said, his eyes distant and troubled. They used the resin to call the Ropen when they needed to send a message to the ancestors, but they also knew that the Ropen does not serve humans. It serves the balance. If you take the resin without permission, if you disturb the resting places, you do not call a servant, you call a judge. Vance had listened to these stories with the condescending patience of a scientist, humoring a primitive worldview. He had made notes, not because he believed the spiritual explanations, but because the chemical description of the resins had given him an idea. If the Ropen was a real animal, and Vance was absolutely convinced that it was, then it must be attracted to the burial sites by some biological mechanism. Perhaps the preservative resins contained volatile organic compounds that the creature could detect from miles away. Perhaps the Ropen used these locations as hunting grounds, knowing that the scent markers drew prey or served some other ecological function. "We don't need to search for it," Vance had announced triumphantly during a team meeting on their third night in Port Moresby. "We need to bait it. The resins are the key. If we can locate an ancient burial site and expose the preservative compounds to the air, we can create a concentration gradient that the Ropen will be unable to resist. It will come to us." Sarah had objected immediately. "These are sacred sites, Marcus. You can't just—" "I can and I will," Vance had interrupted, his eyes flashing with the fanatical intensity that Zack had learned to recognize as the precursor to disaster. "Science doesn't respect superstition, Sarah. If there are resins in those caves, they belong to history, not to some Stone Age death cult. We'll take what we need, document the site, and leave. The locals won't even know we were there." Tobin had known. When they had finally trekked for 4 days through the oppressive jungle, hacking their way through curtains of liana and struggling through mud that sucked at their boots like greedy mouths, the guide had stopped at the mouth of a narrow valley and pointed toward a cliff face carved by ancient rivers into the soft limestone. There, barely visible through the tangle of vegetation, was the dark rectangle of a cave entrance, and in front of it, arranged in a pattern of deliberate geometric precision, were stones stained black with centuries of weathering. "The place of the old ones," Tobin had whispered, making a sign with his fingers that Zack didn't recognize but which conveyed a profound and terrible reverence. "You must not enter." But Vance had entered. He had entered with Vasquez and Park in their equipment bags, leaving Zack and Sarah and Tobin outside in the humid afternoon. They had been inside for hours, their headlamps creating bobbing constellations of light in the darkness of the cave mouth, their voices echoing in muffled fragments of excitement and discovery. When they had emerged, their faces were flushed with triumph, and Vance had been carrying a small ceramic vessel wrapped in layers of protective foam. "The resins," he had announced, holding the vessel up to the fading light. "Still potent after 300 years. You can smell it sharp, almost citrusy, with that underlying chemical note. Phenolic compounds, I'd wager, mixed with terpenes and something else. Something I can't identify yet, but the chromatograph will tell us everything." Sarah had stared at the vessel with an expression of dawning horror. "You took it from the body, didn't you? The open casket Tobin described." Vance's smile had been the smile of a man who had crossed a line and found the view from the other side exhilarating. The casket was carved from a single log, lined with the resin-soaked bark of the ironwood tree, the body inside, remarkably well preserved. The resins had mummified the tissues. I took a sample from the lining, not the body itself. But yes, I exposed the remains to air. The oxidation process will release a burst of volatile compounds, perfect for our purposes. Tobin had turned away, his shoulders hunched, his face a mask of despair. "You have marked yourselves," he had said quietly. "You have marked yourselves, and the night is coming." They had made camp 2 kilometers from the cave, in a clearing beside a sluggish river where the canopy opened enough to allow satellite communication with their base. Vance had set up his equipment with the meticulous care of a man preparing for the experiment of a lifetime. A portable chromatograph, infrared cameras, audio recorders with parabolic microphones, and a high-intensity spotlight array capable of illuminating the entire sky. He had mixed the ancient resin with a solvent, creating a concentrated solution that he placed in an open container at the edge of the camp, upwind from their tents. "The scent cone will spread for miles," he had explained, his voice trembling with anticipation. If there's anything out there with a sensitive enough olfactory system, it will home in on this location like a missile. Zach had helped with the preparations, driven by a mixture of scientific curiosity and the desperate hope that Vance was right, that the Ropen was real, that they would capture definitive evidence, that their careers would be resurrected from the ashes of disgrace. But as night fell over the jungle, bringing with it a darkness so complete it felt like a physical pressure against the eyeballs, Zach had felt the first stirrings of genuine unease. The jungle at night was never silent. That was the first thing that struck him. It was a symphony of sound, a layered tapestry of chirps and buzzes and rustles, and calls that spoke of an ecosystem teeming with life. But as the hours passed and Vance's resin bait began to evaporate into the humid air, the sounds had begun to change. The insects had fallen silent first, their ceaseless droning cutting off with an abruptness that was almost comical in its precision. Then the frogs, whose choruses had provided a constant liquid backdrop to their preparations, had stopped mid-call, leaving a silence that rang in the ears like a scream. "Did you hear that?" Sarah had asked, sitting up in her camp chair, her body suddenly tense. Zach had heard it, a faint sound almost imperceptible like the rustle of silk against silk, coming from somewhere high above them. He had tilted his head back, staring into the narrow strip of visible sky between the towering canopy trees, and for a moment, a single heart-stopping moment, he had thought he saw something. It was a light, a faint, flickering glow like a distant flashlight with a dying battery or a malfunctioning neon sign in a forgotten alley. It pulsed with an irregular rhythm, brightening and dimming in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. At first, Zach had assumed it was another expedition, or perhaps a helicopter from one of the mining operations that had begun encroaching on the protected lands. But as he watched, his neck craned backward until the tendons screamed in protest, he had realized that the light was not stationary. It was descending. The movement was so slow, so graceful, that it was almost imperceptible. The light seemed to drift downward like a falling leaf, bobbing gently on unseen currents of air, its color shifting subtly from a pale white to a faint, sickly green. It passed behind the canopy layer, vanishing from sight for long minutes, only to reappear in a different position, closer now, its glow refracted through the leaves and branches into 1,000 emerald fragments. "Marcus," Sarah had called out, her voice tight with a fear she couldn't quite articulate. "Marcus, look at the sky." Vance had looked. They had all looked, the entire team gathered in a tight cluster at the center of the camp, their faces upturned, their scientific equipment forgotten. The light had continued its descent, and as it drew closer, details had begun to emerge that defied rational explanation. The glow was not uniform. It was segmented, broken into distinct patches that pulsed in sequence, creating a wave-like pattern of illumination that traveled along an invisible form. And there were sounds now, those same clicking noises that Zach would later hear in the limestone crevice, rhythmic and deliberate, accompanied by a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the air itself. "My God," Vance had whispered, and for the first time since Zach had known him, there was no triumph in his voice, only awe and the first seeds of terror. The light had dropped below the canopy level, hovering now approximately 50 meters above the treetops, close enough that they could see the way the glow backlit the leaves and branches, creating a halo effect of impossible beauty and impossible wrongness. It was green, pure, unadulterated neon green, the color of toxic waste and emergency exit signs, and the phosphorescent nightmares of deep-sea fish. And it was moving in a slow, deliberate circle around the camp, its clicking sounds echoing off the limestone cliffs in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint its exact location. "It's circling," Park had said, his voice high and thin. "Why is it circling? Why doesn't it just come down?" "It's assessing," Vance had replied, but his scientific authority had sounded hollow, even to his own ears. Predators circle their prey to evaluate threat levels and escape routes. It's studying us. The creature had circled for 20 minutes, its bioluminescence creating a stroboscopic effect as it passed behind trees and emerged again, each glimpse revealing a fraction more of its impossible form. They had seen wings, vast, membranous structures that caught the green light like stained glass, their edges lined with what appeared to be clawed digits. They had seen a tail, long and whip-like, terminating in a diamond-shaped vein that flickered with its own independent glow. And they had seen, in the moments when the light aligned perfectly with their line of sight, the silhouette of a head bearing a beak that curved like a scythe, its interior lined with needle-sharp teeth that caught the luminescence and refracted it into points of emerald fire. "It's too big," Vasquez had breathed, her scientific training warring with the evidence of her senses. The wing loading, the metabolic requirements, it shouldn't be able to fly. "It's not flying," Tobin had said from the shadows at the edge of the camp. He had not moved, had not looked up, his face buried in his hands. "It is swimming, swimming through the air as a shark swims through water, and you have invited it to feed." The Ropen had not attacked immediately. That was the most terrifying aspect of those first hours, the realization that the creature was not a mindless beast driven by instinct, but a calculating, strategic predator that understood the geometry of fear. It had continued its circling, its clicking sounds growing louder and more insistent, its bioluminescence pulsing in patterns that seemed to have a hypnotic quality, drawing the eye, holding the attention, making it impossible to look away. And then, without warning, the light had vanished. One moment it was there, a hovering constellation of emerald fire against the black sky. The next, darkness had slammed down with the force of a physical blow, so complete and so sudden that Zack had stumbled, his balance compromised by the abrupt absence of visual reference. The clicking sounds had stopped. The hum had ceased. The jungle had remained silent, a silence that was somehow more oppressive than the presence of the creature had been. "Where did it go?" Park had whispered, his head swiveling wildly, his flashlight beam cutting panicked arcs through the darkness. "It's still here," Tobin had said, his voice flat and dead. "It is hunting now. The light was only to see. Now it knows where you are. Now it knows how you move. Now it will take you." The first attack had come 10 minutes later, not from the sky but from the trees. A sound like a whip crack, a rush of displaced air, and then Park had screamed, a short, truncated cry that had ended in a wet gurgle. Zack had spun, his flashlight beam catching a nightmare flash of leathery wing and clawed foot, and then the light had found only empty space where Park had been standing. "Jimmy," Vasquez had shrieked, running toward the spot where her student had vanished, her own flashlight creating jagged, dancing shadows. "Jimmy, answer me." A clicking sound had answered her. It had come from directly above, and as she had looked up, the green light had flared again, brilliant and blinding, illuminating the creature in full for the first time. It had been perched on a branch 30 meters up, its wings folded against its body, its head lowered to examine its prize. And in its claws, those terrible, jointed claws that ended in translucent hooks like shards of obsidian, it had held Jimmy Park, or what remained of him. The young man's body had hung limp, his chest cavity opened with surgical precision, his organs gleaming in the green light like wet jewels. The Ropen had not eaten him. It had examined him, turning the body this way and that with the clinical curiosity of a scientist studying a specimen. And then, with a contemptuous flick of its claws, it had released the corpse, allowing it to plummet through the canopy and crash into the undergrowth with a sound like a sack of wet laundry hitting concrete. "Run," Tobin had said, his voice barely audible. "Run now and do not stop." They had run. Vasquez had sprinted into the jungle without direction, her screams receding into the darkness until they had been cut off by a sound like a sheet being torn in half. Vance had grabbed his equipment bag, his face a mask of insanity and denial, and had stumbled toward the river, shouting about documentation and evidence and the need to preserve the data. Zach had never seen him again, though he had heard the sounds, the clicking, the rush of wings, the wet impacts, as he had fled with Sarah into the limestone karst. And now they were here, huddled in the crevice, listening to the creature above them, watching the green light paint their tomb in shades of radioactive terror. The clicking had stopped, but the glow remained, pulsing against the wet stone in a slow, deliberate rhythm that suggested patience. The patience of a predator that had all the time in the world and prey that had nowhere left to go. "It's going to wait us out," Zach whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's smart, Sarah. It's not just an animal. It understands that we're trapped. It knows we can't stay here forever." Sarah's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers icy cold and trembling. "Then what do we do?" Zach stared at the pulsing green light, watching it play across the fossilized shells in the limestone, remembering the stories Tabin had told them about the creature's hunting patterns. The Ropen didn't just kill for food. It collected. It cached. It was building a larder, and they were the next specimens to be added to its collection. "We survive," he said, the word tasting like ash on his tongue. "However long it takes, whatever we have to do, we survive until morning and then we find a way out." But even as he spoke the words, Zach knew they were lies. The Ropen was above them, patient and eternal, and the night in this jungle lasted forever. The green light pulsed brighter, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the crevice, the clicking began again, slow, rhythmic, and utterly inescapable. The hunt had only just begun. Time in the crevice became a fluid, nightmarish thing, stretching and compressing according to the rhythms of the green light that pulsed against the limestone walls. Zach had tried to measure the passage of hours by counting the beats of his own heart, but the terror had accelerated his pulse to a galloping tempo that rendered the exercise meaningless. He guessed that they had been crouched in the fissure for at least 3 hours, perhaps 4, though it could have been 40 minutes or 4 days. The darkness outside the narrow opening of their refuge was absolute, a velvet void that swallowed every photon and returned nothing, and the only illumination came from the creature above them, its bioluminescence filtering down through the crack in the earth like radiation from a contaminated sky. Sarah had fallen into a state that was neither sleep nor unconsciousness, a kind of waking catalepsy brought on by exhaustion and shock. Her head rested against Zach's shoulder, her breathing shallow and irregular, punctuated by small whimpering sounds that she seemed unaware of producing. Tabin sat on her other side, his back pressed against the opposite wall of the crevice, his face hidden in his hands. He had not spoken since they had fled the camp, had not offered any guidance or comfort, had simply followed them into the darkness with the resigned fatalism of a man who had seen this ending from the beginning. "We can't stay here," Zach whispered, his voice rough from dehydration and fear. "If it knows we're here, it's only a matter of time before it finds a way in, or before we die of exposure." Tabin lifted his head slowly, his eyes reflecting the pulsing green light like twin emeralds set in a mask of ancient grief. "The crevice is narrow," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Too narrow for the demon flyer to enter, but you are correct. It will not need to enter. It will only need to wait." "Wait for what?" "For hunger, for opportunity, for you to make the mistake that all prey makes." Tabin's gaze drifted upward toward the faint strip of starless sky visible through the rock above them. "The Ropen does not rush. It has not survived for 1,000,000 years by being impatient. It will circle and watch and learn your patterns, and when you are weak enough, frightened enough, desperate enough to move, it will be ready." Zach considered this, his mind racing through possibilities and strategies with the desperate energy of a cornered animal. They had no weapons to speak of. Their firearms had been left at the camp in the panic of the initial attack, and even if they had retained them, the thought of firing at the creature seemed almost absurd, like trying to stop a freight train with a pea shooter. They had no food, no water, no communications equipment. They had only the clothes on their backs and the meager protection of the limestone walls. "Then we need to move before it expects us to," Zack said, the words coming out with more certainty than he felt. "If it's waiting for us to weaken, then we need to act while we still have strength. There must be other passages through this karst. Caves, tunnels, anything that leads away from here." "The limestone is full of passages," Tobin agreed, "but most of them lead nowhere. Dead ends, collapsed chambers, underground rivers that flow into darkness, and in the dark you will not see the dead ends until you are pressing your face against them. Better than sitting here waiting to die." Sarah stirred against Zack's shoulder, her eyes fluttering open. She had heard their conversation, Zack realized, had been listening even in her half-conscious state. "The map," she mumbled, her voice thick and slurred. "Vance had a topographical map, contour lines showing the drainage patterns, if we can find higher ground." "The map was in the camp," Zack said gently, "along with everything else. I memorized it." Sarah pulled herself upright, wincing as her cramped muscles protested. "I always memorize maps. Occupational hazard of working with archaeologists who lose things. The karst system extends northeast toward the coast. There's a ridgeline approximately 2 kilometers from here where the limestone gives way to volcanic basalt. Harder rock, fewer caves, more cover." 2 kilometers, Zack repeated. "In the dark, through terrain we can't see. Do you have a better plan?" He didn't. And so, after a whispered discussion that lasted no more than 2 minutes, they made their decision. They would wait for the next cycle of the creature's bioluminescence to dim, those brief intervals when the green light faded to its lowest intensity, and then they would move northeast, following the natural drainage of the karst, hoping to find passages that led toward the ridgeline and salvation. The clicking sounds above them had ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to have weight and texture, like cotton packed into the ears. But the green light remained, pulsing in that slow, hypnotic rhythm that Zack had come to recognize as the creature's signature. It was dimmer now, he realized, studying the reflections on the wet stone. Not the brilliant, blinding emerald of the initial attack, but a softer, more diffuse glow, like bioluminescent algae on a midnight tide. "Now," Tobin whispered, reading the same signs, "it is resting or hunting elsewhere. Now is the only chance you will get." They moved with the exaggerated caution of bomb disposal experts, each step placed with painstaking precision to avoid the telltale scuff of boot against stone. The crevice narrowed to a vertical chimney approximately 10 meters from their starting position, requiring them to wedge themselves between the walls and inch upward using friction and prayer. Zack went first, his muscles screaming in protest as he pressed his palms and feet against the opposing surfaces, his body suspended over a black void that yawned beneath him, with the hungry patience of a waiting mouth. Sarah followed, her smaller frame making the passage slightly easier, though he heard her breath catch in her throat as she navigated the same terrifying squeeze. Tobin came last, moving with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life in these rocks, his fingers finding holds that Zack would never have seen. They emerged from the chimney into a wider passage, a natural tunnel carved by millennia of water through the soluble limestone. The floor was uneven, treacherous with loose stones and the fossilized remnants of ancient shell beds, and the walls sweated with a perpetual moisture that made every surface slick and treacherous. But the tunnel ran in roughly the right direction, and after 20 minutes of stumbling progress, Zack began to allow himself the first fragile tendril of hope. That hope shattered with the return of the clicking. It came from behind them, echoing down the tunnel with the clarity of a struck bell. Click, 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 click. The same rhythmic pattern they had heard in the crevice, but closer now, intimate, almost conversational in its precision. And with it came the light, not the diffuse glow of before, but a concentrated beam of neon green that swept across the tunnel walls like a searchlight, illuminating the calcite formations in shades of radioactive beauty. "It's hurting us," Sarah gasped, breaking into a run despite the treacherous footing. Don't you see, it's pushing us forward." She was right. The light never quite touched them, always remaining behind, sweeping from wall to wall in a pattern that seemed calculated to maximize their panic and minimize their options for retreat. The clicking grew louder, more insistent, and Zack became aware of a new sound, the rhythmic beat of enormous wings, creating pressure waves that stirred the stagnant air of the tunnel and carried the smell of ozone and rotting flowers. They ran. There was no other option, no time for strategy or stealth. Zack's world narrowed to the beam of his penlight, the only illumination they had besides the pursuing green glow, and the desperate need to keep moving, to stay ahead of the thing that was driving them forward like cattle before a storm. The tunnel twisted and branched, splitting into forks and intersections that forced split-second decisions, and Zack navigated by instinct and Sarah's remembered topography, always choosing the path that seemed to lead upward and northeast. After what felt like an eternity of flight, they burst from the tunnel into open air, and Zack's heart sank with the sudden finality of a condemned man's last walk. They had emerged onto a narrow ledge on the face of a cliff, a shelf of limestone no more than 2 meters wide that overlooked a drop of at least 100 meters into absolute darkness. Above them, the sky was still obscured by the dense canopy, but the cliff face rose in a series of sheer vertical steps toward an invisible summit. To their left, the ledge ended in a collapsed section where the rock had sheared away, leaving nothing but empty space. To their right, it narrowed to a knife-edge ridge that disappeared around a bulge of limestone. And in front of them, arranged along the cliff face at various heights like a macabre gallery, were the larders. Zack's flashlight beam, shaking with the tremors of his hand, swept across the scene in a series of jerky arcs, and each arc revealed a new horror that his mind struggled to process and catalog. The Ropen had hollowed out cavities in the limestone, or perhaps had found natural alcoves and enlarged them, creating a series of chambers that dotted the cliff face like the cells of a wasp's nest. But these cells did not contain larvae or food stores in the conventional sense. They contained bodies. Human bodies, animal bodies, things that might have been bodies once, before the processes of desiccation and preservation had transformed them into something else entirely. The nearest chamber was approximately 5 meters above the ledge, accessible only by a vertical climb up a wall that offered no obvious handholds. Inside it, visible through the roughly circular opening, was the corpse of a wild pig, its body suspended by what appeared to be dried sinews or tendons, its skin stretched tight over its bones in a way that suggested it had been hanging for weeks or months. But it had not been eaten in the way that predators typically consume prey. The body was intact, preserved, displayed with a care that spoke not of hunger but of curation. "Oh God," Sarah whispered, her flashlight joining Zack's in a duet of trembling illumination. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." The next chamber was higher, perhaps 15 meters up, and contained something that made Zack's knees weaken with a surge of nausea so intense he nearly vomited. It was a human body. He could tell by the shape, by the proportions, by the tattered remnants of clothing that still clung to the limbs. But it had been transformed into something that resembled a biological specimen more than a person. The skin had been removed in places, the musculature exposed and treated with some substance that had hardened it to the consistency of leather. The eyes had been replaced with stones, smooth, white river stones that gleamed in the flashlight beams with an obscene imitation of life. And the body had been positioned, posed, arranged in a sitting position with its legs crossed and its hands folded in its lap, as if waiting for an appointment that would never come. "It's collecting," Tobin said, his voice devoid of emotion, a hollow tube through which words passed without touching anything human. "The old stories spoke of this. The Ropen does not kill for hunger alone. It kills for the same reason that humans mount butterflies in glass cases, for preservation, for display, for the assertion of dominion over life and death." Zack's light swept higher, revealing more chambers, more specimens, a vertical museum of horror that extended up the cliff face as far as his beam could reach. There were birds, their wings spread in eternal flight, pinned to the rock with wooden stakes. There were snakes, coiled in impossible spirals, their scales polished to a mirror shine. There were primates, their faces frozen in expressions of terror so vivid that Zack could almost believe they had been preserved alive, their mouths open in silent screams that would never find ears to hear them. And there, in a chamber approximately 30 meters up, in a space that glowed faintly with the same neon-green luminescence that marked the creature itself, was something that made Zack's vision blur at the edges with the onset of hyperventilation and shock. It was James Park. The graduate student hung suspended in the center of the chamber, his body wrapped in a cocoon of what appeared to be dried, translucent membrane, the same leathery material that formed the creature's wings. The cocoon was partially open at the chest, revealing the cavity where his organs had been removed with surgical precision and replaced with bundles of dried herbs and flowers that emitted a faint, sweet scent even from this distance. His face was visible, or what remained of it, his eyes wide and staring, his mouth set in a rictus grin that suggested the final moments of his life had been spent in an ecstasy of terror, beyond anything the human nervous system was designed to endure. "It's not eating them," Sarah said, her voice rising toward hysteria. "It's not even killing them for food, it's curating, it's building a collection. We're not prey, Zack, we're specimens, we're art." The clicking sound returned, louder now, and Zack realized with a surge of renewed panic that it was coming from above them. He tilted his head back, his flashlight beam stabbing upward into the darkness, and for a moment, a single, eternal moment, he saw the Ropen. It was perched on an outcropping approximately 20 meters above their ledge, its body folded into a compact shape that somehow made it seem even larger than it had appeared in flight. The green light emanated from patches along its body, strips of bioluminescent tissue that ran along the leading edges of its wings, clusters of glowing nodules on its chest and throat, a single brilliant beacon of emerald fire at the tip of its long, whip-like tail. In the combined illumination of the creature's own glow and their flashlight beams, Zack could see details that his mind would never be able to unsee. The creature's body was covered in a fine, downy fur that shifted color with the light, from charcoal gray to iridescent green. Its wings, folded now against its flanks, showed the intricate veining of a bat's membrane combined with the structural reinforcement of a pterosaur's patagium, a masterpiece of biological engineering that explained how something so massive could achieve sustained flight. But it was the head that held Zack's attention with the hypnotic power of a serpent regarding a mouse. The skull was elongated, avian but wrong, proportioned according to geometries that evolution had never sanctioned. The beak curved downward in a hook of obsidian keratin, longer than a man's forearm, its inner surface lined with rows of backward-curving teeth that glinted in the green light like hypodermic needles. Above the beak, where a bird would have eyes, were two enormous orbs that seemed to contain no pupils, no irises, only a continuous field of phosphorescent green that glowed with an internal light of their own. And between and above those eyes, rising from the skull in a crest of bone and membrane, was a structure that pulsed with the brightest luminescence of all, an organ that seemed to serve no aerodynamic purpose, existing solely to produce light. The Ropen tilted its head, that alien motion that conveyed intelligence and curiosity in equal measure, and the clicking sounds intensified. It was studying them, Zack realized, evaluating them, deciding where they fit in its collection. "The ridge," Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm with fingers that bit into his flesh like talons. "If we can get around that corner, the ledge widens. There's cover, trees, roots we can climb. And if we can't get around the corner before it decides we're ready for preservation, then we die standing still instead of dying running." She had a point, a terrible, undeniable point. Zack took one last look at the creature above them, At the Museum of Horrors, it had built into the cliff face, at the preserved remains of Jimmy Park grinning down at him from his membranous cocoon, and then he ran. The knife-edge ridge was worse than he had imagined, a sliver of limestone no wider than a balance beam, its surface worn smooth by centuries of rain and wind into a surface that offered less traction than ice. To his left, the cliff face rose in a vertical wall that denied handholds. To his right, the void yawned, a blackness so complete it seemed to pull at his center of gravity, urging him to step into its embrace. Sarah moved ahead of him, her smaller frame an advantage on the narrow path, her arms windmilling for balance with each step. Tobin followed, moving with the same fatalistic calm he had displayed throughout the nightmare, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that seemed to hold more interest for him than the imminent threat of falling. The clicking sounds grew louder closer, and Zack realized that the creature had launched itself from its perch. He didn't need to look back to know that it was following them, gliding along the cliff face with the effortless grace of a creature that had mastered three-dimensional movement millions of years before humans had learned to walk upright. The green light intensified, casting their shadows against the rock in grotesque caricature, and the wind from its passing stirred the humid air into a miniature cyclone that threatened to tear them from the ridge. "Faster!" Sarah screamed, her voice barely audible over the thunder of wings. They rounded the bulge of limestone, and for a moment Zack allowed himself to believe that they had made it, that the ridge widened into the promised sanctuary of wider ledges and climbing trees. But what they found instead was worse than the narrow path they had left behind. It was a camp, or what remained of one. The reinforced research tent had been Vance's pride and joy, a state-of-the-art shelter designed to withstand hurricane-force winds and the depredations of curious wildlife. It sat now in the center of a small clearing, its gray fabric glowing softly in the moonlight that somehow managed to penetrate the canopy at this particular spot. The tent was intact, or appeared to be, its walls taut and its shape undistorted. But as Zack stumbled toward it, his legs buckling with relief and exhaustion, he noticed details that made him pause. The support cables were wrong. Vance had rigged the tent with a network of guy lines and anchor points, fastening it to trees and boulders with a paranoid thoroughness that had seemed excessive in daylight but now appeared prescient. But looking at those cables in the green-tinted darkness, Zack could see that they had been modified. Not cut. That would have caused the tent to collapse immediately, but partially severed, weakened at precise points where the tension was greatest, where the weight of the fabric and the frame would eventually cause them to snap. "It's a trap," Zack breathed, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "It knew we'd come here. It knew we'd look for shelter. It's been waiting for us." "We don't have a choice," Sarah said, her eyes darting back toward the corner of the ridge, where the sound of approaching wings was growing louder with each heartbeat. "The tent has a steel frame, reinforced walls. It's the most defensible structure for kilometers. If we stay outside, we're dead. If we go inside, we might have a chance." Tobin shook his head slowly, but he didn't argue. He simply followed them toward the tent, his movements mechanical, his expression that of a man who had already accepted the inevitability of his fate. They entered through the front flap, which had been left hanging open in a way that suggested hurried abandonment. The interior was exactly as Zack remembered it from their first night in the jungle. The equipment cases stacked against one wall, the portable table with its still-open notebooks and scattered specimen jars, the cots arranged in a neat row with their mosquito netting tied back. But there were differences now, details that spoke of occupation by something other than human researchers. A smell, for one, the sharp, coppery scent of blood mixed with the chemical sweetness of the preservative resins, hanging in the air like a fog. And on the floor, arranged in a deliberate pattern that suggested intelligence and intention, were scratches in the fabric, long parallel gouges that could only have been made by claws. "It was here," Sarah whispered, staring at the marks. "While we were in the crevice, it came here, it explored, It learned the layout. Then we need to learn it better, Zack said, forcing his voice to remain steady. The frame is steel. The walls are ballistic nylon. If it tries to break through, we'll hear it coming. We'll have time to. The first cable snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and the tent shuddered violently, one corner of the roof sagging as the tension that held it aloft was released. Zack lunged for the center pole, grabbing it with both hands as if his weight could somehow stabilize the structure. But even as he did so, he heard the second cable give way. And then the third, each snap preceded by a faint, almost delicate scratching sound as the creature's claws completed their work. The roof collapsed in slow motion, a sagging, billowing descent of heavy fabric that blotted out the dim moonlight and plunged them into darkness broken only by the sudden, brilliant flare of the creature's bioluminescence. But the green light didn't illuminate the tent from outside. It was inside with them, somehow, moving through the collapsed fabric in strobing flashes that made the interior of the tent into a kaleidoscope of impossible shadows and blinding brilliance. Zack understood then, with the terrible clarity of hindsight, that the Ropen had never intended to break through the walls. It had used its claws with surgical precision to slice the support cables, collapsing the structure on top of them, trapping them in a tangle of fabric and steel that eliminated their mobility and turned the tent from a shelter into a snare. And now, as the green light strobed faster and faster, creating a disorienting, nauseating effect that made the creature seem to appear and vanish in different positions with each flash, it was reaching for them through the folds of the collapsed roof. The stroboscopic effect was maddening. One moment the tent was empty, filled only with the chaotic geometry of fallen fabric and equipment. The next, a wing would materialize from nowhere, membranous and veined, blocking out half the available space. Then darkness. Then the flash of that terrible beak, descending toward Sarah with the speed of a striking cobra. Then darkness again. Then the eyes, those impossible green orbs, hovering inches from Zack's face, studying him with an intensity that suggested recognition, memory, intention. Sarah screamed, a sound that was cut off with surgical abruptness, and when the light flashed again, she was gone. The fabric where she had been standing was torn in a long, clean slash, and through the opening Zack could see the night sky, the stars, and the silhouette of the Ropen ascending with terrible grace, something limp and struggling clutched in its hind claws. "Sarah!" Zack's scream was raw, torn from his throat with a violence that left his vocal cords feeling shredded. He lunged toward the tear in the fabric, his hands finding the edges and pulling with desperate strength, but the ballistic nylon resisted his efforts, stretching and springing back like a living thing. The clicking returned, close now, intimate, and Zack realized with a surge of primal horror that the creature was coming back. It had taken Sarah, had added her to its collection, and now it was returning for the remaining specimens. The green light intensified, filling the collapsed tent with a radiance that turned the fabric walls into translucent panels of emerald glass, and through those panels Zack could see the shadow of the Ropen, circling, descending, preparing for its final approach. Tobin was gone. Zack didn't know when the guide had vanished, whether he had been taken in one of the stroboscopic flashes or had simply slipped away into the darkness, accepting his fate with the same quiet resignation he had shown throughout. Zack was alone now, truly alone, trapped in a collapsed tent with a creature that had demonstrated more intelligence, more patience, and more strategic sophistication than any predator had a right to possess. The green light pulsed once, twice, 3 times. A signal, Zack realized, a communication. And then the fabric above him parted, not with a tear but with a precise incision, and a claw descended through the opening, its tip gleaming in the phosphorescent glow, reaching for his face with the gentle inevitability of a mother reaching for a sleeping child. Zack did the only thing his terrified brain could process. He grabbed the portable chromatograph from the equipment case beside him, a heavy, solid instrument of metal and glass weighing approximately 8 kilograms, and he swung it with every ounce of strength his adrenaline-flooded muscles could generate. The impact was not dramatic. The chromatograph connected with the descending claw with a wet, cracking sound, like a baseball bat hitting a side of beef, and the creature emitted a sound that was not a screech or a roar but something far worse. A resonant, harmonic vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a frequency that resonated in Zach's bones and teeth and made his vision blur with pain. The claw withdrew, vanishing through the slit in the fabric, and the green light dimmed, retreated, pulled back to a distance that suggested pain or caution or recalculation. Zach didn't wait to find out which. He attacked the fabric with his bare hands, tearing at the ballistic nylon with a strength born of pure survival instinct, widening the slit the creature had made until it was large enough to squeeze through. He emerged into the night air gasping, his lungs desperate for oxygen, his body covered in sweat and the fine powder of pulverized limestone. The clearing was empty. The Ropen had withdrawn or was circling at a distance, reassessing its injured prey. But Zach knew it would be back. It was patient, it was eternal, and it had already collected one specimen tonight. "Sarah," he whispered into the darkness, his voice breaking. "Sarah, where are you?" The jungle answered with silence, broken only by the distant clicking sounds that seemed to come from every direction at once. And high above, barely visible against the star-scattered sky, a single point of neon green light pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, a beacon marking the location of the creature's newest acquisition. Zach stood alone in the clearing, surrounded by the ruins of the tent and the scattered equipment of a failed expedition, and for the first time since the nightmare had begun, he allowed himself to weep. The tears were hot and bitter, and they tasted of copper and ash, and the absolute certainty that he was going to die in this jungle, alone and unremembered, another specimen in a collection that had been growing for millennia. But somewhere in the darkness the clicking continued, and somewhere in the darkness Sarah was still alive. Zach wiped his eyes, his jaw setting with a determination that surprised him. If she was alive, there was a chance. If the creature collected rather than killed immediately, there was time. And if there was time, there was hope, however slender, however desperate. He began to gather the equipment that had survived the tent's collapse: flares, a radio, a half-empty canteen. The Ropen might be a monster out of nightmare, but it had demonstrated weakness. It could be hurt. It could be driven back. And Zach Holloway, disgraced paleontologist and failed academic, was going to find a way to make it regret ever considering him as prey. The green light pulsed in the distance, mocking him. Zach shouldered his meager pack and began to walk toward it, his footsteps steady, his heart hammering a rhythm of defiance against the ancient darkness of the jungle night. The hunt, it seemed, was not yet over. The equipment Zach managed to salvage from the ruins of the tent amounted to a pitiful collection of objects that seemed almost insulting in their inadequacy against the threat he faced. There was the portable radio, its casing cracked but its power indicator still showing a faint, hopeful green. There was a half-empty canteen of water that tasted of plastic and aluminum. There was a machete with a blade dulled from hacking through jungle undergrowth. And there, buried beneath a collapsed equipment case that had miraculously survived the tent's destruction, was the flare gun, a heavy, pistol-shaped device loaded with 3 high-intensity magnesium flares that Vance had packed for emergency signaling. Zach held the flare gun in his hands, feeling its weight, studying its lines with the desperate intensity of a drowning man examining a life raft. The weapon was designed to launch a burning star into the sky, a beacon visible for 20 kilometers in clear conditions. But in the closed quarters of the jungle canopy, in the narrow passages of the limestone karst, the effect would be blinding, overwhelming, a searing point of white-hot magnesium brilliance that would turn night into noon for precious seconds. He remembered something then, a fragment of conversation from the earliest days of the expedition, when they had still been in Port Moresby, and the world had held the shape of rational possibility. They had been discussing the Ropen's hunting strategies, speculating about the evolutionary pressures that might have produced a nocturnal aerial predator with bioluminescent capabilities. Vance had been in rare form that evening, pacing the hotel room with the manic energy of a prophet receiving divine revelation, sketching diagrams on napkins and muttering equations under his breath. "The eyes," Vance had said, his pen stabbing at a crude drawing of an elongated skull. "They're the key. If this thing hunts at night, if it produces its own light, then its eyes must be adapted to extremely low-light conditions. The tapetum lucidum, that reflective layer behind the retina that enhances night vision in predators, would be hyperdeveloped. But there's a trade-off. Hyperdeveloped night vision means extreme sensitivity to sudden bright light. A magnesium flare at close range wouldn't just startle it, it would temporarily blind it, maybe even damage the photoreceptors." Zach had dismissed the conversation at the time as typical Vance speculation, brilliant but untested, theoretical without empirical foundation. But now, standing in the ruins of the camp with the flare gun heavy in his hands, he clung to that fragment of memory with the desperation of a man clutching a rosary. The Ropen was sensitive to light. It hunted in darkness, produced its own illumination, navigated by bioluminescence. A sudden burst of intense white light might be the only weapon he had. But first, he needed to find Sarah. The green light in the distance had stabilized into a fixed point, pulsing with a slow, hypnotic rhythm that suggested the creature had reached its destination, one of the larders, perhaps, or a processing site where it prepared its specimens for preservation and display. Zach oriented himself by that beacon, using it as a navigational star in a sky that offered no other reference points. The terrain between him and the light was brutal, a maze of fallen trees and razor-sharp limestone shards that cut through his boots and left a trail of blood from his torn soles. But he moved with a single-minded determination that bordered on madness, ignoring pain, ignoring exhaustion, ignoring the small voice in his mind that whispered he was walking directly into the predator's lair. The clicking sounds returned as he drew closer, not the aggressive, hunting clicks he had heard before, but a slower, more contented rhythm that suggested satisfaction, completion, the relaxation of a predator that had secured its meal and was preparing to feed. Or preserve, or whatever it was that the Ropen did with its collected specimens. Zach forced himself to move more quietly, placing each step with excruciating care, his ears straining to separate the creature's sounds from the background symphony of the jungle night. He found the larder approximately 40 minutes after leaving the camp, guided by the intensifying green glow and the unmistakable scent of preservative resins that hung in the air like a chemical fog. It was not one of the cliffside chambers he had seen earlier, but a hollowed-out tree of massive proportions. A kapok or banyan, Zach guessed, though botanical precision seemed irrelevant in the face of what the tree contained. The trunk had been excavated with claw marks that spoke of patient, methodical work, creating a cylindrical chamber that rose 3 meters from the forest floor and opened to the sky through a natural gap in the canopy. And suspended in the center of that chamber, wrapped in translucent membranes that caught the creature's green glow and refracted it into patterns of unholy beauty, was Sarah. She was alive. That was the first thing Zach noticed, the first fact that penetrated the fog of his terror and grief. Her chest was moving, rising and falling in shallow, irregular breaths that suggested she was conscious but deeply sedated or traumatized. The membranes that bound her were not tight. They draped around her body like a loose shroud, leaving her limbs relatively free, and her head lolled to one side in a way that suggested she had been positioned deliberately, arranged for display rather than secured for transport. The Ropen was not in the tree. Zach could see the chamber clearly from his hiding place behind a fallen log, and the creature was absent, though its light remained, emanating from patches of bioluminescent fungus that had been cultivated on the inner walls of the hollow trunk. The creature had left its newest specimen in the larder and gone elsewhere, perhaps to hunt additional prey, perhaps to retrieve materials for the preservation process, perhaps simply to patrol its territory in the patient, eternal manner of an apex predator that had never learned the meaning of urgency. Zack didn't allow himself time to think. He sprinted toward the tree, his boots crunching against the leaf litter, his heart hammering a countdown in his chest. The chamber was too high to reach from the ground, but the tree's bark was deeply furrowed, providing handholds that allowed him to climb with a speed born of desperation. He reached the opening in seconds, hauled himself over the lip, and dropped into the chamber beside Sarah's suspended form. "Sarah," he whispered, shaking her shoulder with a gentleness that warred with his panic. "Sarah, wake up. We have to move, now." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy, the pupils dilated to black pools that swallowed the green light. "Zack," her voice was thick, slurred, as if she had been drugged. I was dreaming. There was music, beautiful music. It's not a dream, it's real, and we need to go." He began tearing at the membranes with his hands, discovering that they were not as tough as they appeared, more like dried animal intestine than the leathery wing tissue he had expected. They peeled away with a tearing sound that seemed loud enough to wake the dead, and Sarah's body sagged against him, her legs unable to support her weight. Zack slung her arm over his shoulder, supporting her with an arm around her waist, and began the awkward process of lowering her from the chamber. They had reached the ground, Sarah's feet finding uncertain purchase on the forest floor, when the clicking returned. It was close this time, terrifyingly close, coming from the canopy directly above them. Zack looked up and saw the green light intensifying, filtering down through the leaves in a cascade of emerald photons that turned the forest floor into a stage set for a nightmare. The creature was returning. It had detected the disturbance, or perhaps simply completed whatever business had taken it from the larder, and it was coming back to find its specimen missing. "Run," Zack gasped, pulling Sarah forward with a strength he didn't know he possessed. "Sarah, run." They ran, not toward the camp, not toward any remembered landmark, but simply away in the direction that seemed to offer the most cover, the most obstacles, the most chances to put distance between themselves and the death that descended from above. Sarah's sedation slowed her, her legs moving in a drunken stagger that made every step an ordeal, but Zack supported her, half carrying her through the undergrowth, his own body screaming in protest at the exertion. The green light pursued them, not directly overhead but always to one side or the other, herding them, guiding them, pushing them toward terrain that Zack gradually realized was becoming more open, more exposed. They burst from dense jungle into a zone of scrub and bare limestone, a region where the trees had been stunted by poor soil and the ground was naked rock, offering no cover, no concealment, nowhere to hide from the eyes that burned with emerald fire in the sky above. "It's hurting us," Sarah panted, her voice clearer now, the adrenaline burning through whatever sedative the creature had administered. "Zack, it's pushing us somewhere." She was right. The creature was not attacking, not swooping in for the kill. It was maintaining a precise distance, its bioluminescence creating walls of light that steered them like sheep in a pen, directing their flight along paths that the predator had chosen. And ahead of them, Zack could now see the destination that the Ropen had selected for them, a narrow gorge, a split in the limestone that ran between two sheer walls of rock, creating a passage that extended into darkness. "The canyon," Zack breathed, remembering the topographical maps, the contour lines that showed drainage patterns and geological formations. "It wants us in the canyon." "Why?" Sarah asked, but even as she spoke she understood. The canyon was narrow, confined, a space where the creature's enormous wingspan would be an advantage rather than a limitation, where there would be no room to dodge, no cover to hide behind, no escape from the death that descended from above. But Zack saw something else. The canyon walls were close together at the entrance, but the maps had shown a section approximately 200 meters in where the passage constricted to a width of less than 3 meters, a space too narrow for the Ropen's wings, a bottleneck where aerial superiority became physical impossibility. "The flares," Zack said, his hand finding the flare gun in his pocket. "If we can reach the narrow section, if we can blind it long enough to get inside." "It's suicide," Sarah said. "Everything is suicide. This is just suicide with a chance." They turned toward the canyon, making the decision together without words, and ran for the entrance with the last reserves of their strength. The Ropen seemed to sense their compliance, or perhaps simply approved of their choice of direction, because the clicking sounds intensified into a rapid, excited staccato, and the green light pulsed brighter, bathing the limestone walls in shades of radioactive brilliance that turned the night into a grotesque parody of day. They entered the canyon at a sprint, their boots slipping on the smooth, water-worn stone of the passage floor. The walls rose on either side in vertical cliffs of pale limestone, their surfaces striated with fossilized shells and ancient coral formations that caught the green light and reflected it back in a million emerald facets. The passage was approximately 8 meters wide at the entrance, wide enough for the Ropen to enter without difficulty, and Zack could hear the creature behind them, its wings creating thunderous pressure waves that echoed off the canyon walls and stirred the dust into swirling clouds. "Faster," Zack urged, pulling Sarah forward. "It's coming." The canyon narrowed as they ran, the walls drawing closer with each meter, the roof lowering until they were running through a passage that felt less like a geological feature and more like a throat, a constriction in the earth that was slowly swallowing them. 7 meters, 6 meters, 5. The Ropen was directly behind them now, its clicking sounds reverberating in the confined space with a volume that was physically painful, the pressure waves from its wings strong enough to knock them off balance. 4 meters, 3.5. The passage was becoming a squeeze, their shoulders brushing against the damp limestone, their progress slowed by the need to navigate between outcroppings and fallen boulders. And behind them, the creature was entering the canyon, its bioluminescence turning the walls into a strobing nightmare of light and shadow. Zack could hear it now, not just the clicking and the wing beats but the actual sound of its body moving through the confined space, the scrape of claws against stone, the rustle of membrane against rock, the wet, organic sounds of a massive creature compressing itself into a space that was too small for it. The ground shook with each beat of its wings, a rhythmic vibration that traveled up through Zack's boots and into his teeth, making his vision blur with each impact. "Almost there," Sarah gasped, pointing ahead to a section where the walls seemed to press together in a natural constriction. "The narrow part, Zack, the narrow part." They reached it, a section of canyon barely 2.5 meters wide, where a geological fault had sheared the limestone into a passage that seemed designed by nature specifically to deny entry to flying creatures. Zack shoved Sarah through first, her body scraping against the rock, and then squeezed through himself, his chest pressing against one wall and his back against the other, the flare gun clutched in his hand like a holy relic. The Ropen hit the constriction seconds later, and the sound it made was unlike anything Zack had ever heard. A resonant, grinding shriek of frustration and pain as its wings folded against its body, and it attempted to force itself through a space that was physically too small for its span. But the creature did not retreat. Instead, it compressed itself, its body deforming in ways that defied skeletal logic, its cartilage-based wing bones bending and folding like the ribs of an umbrella, allowing it to squeeze into the passage with a determination that spoke of infinite patience and absolute hunger. "It's fitting," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the creature's struggles. "Zack, it's actually fitting." Zack raised the flare gun, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely keep the weapon steady. The creature was less than 10 meters away now, its head visible in the green glow of its own body, that terrible beak opening and closing with a mechanical precision that suggested anticipation. He could see its eyes, those impossible, pupil-less orbs of phosphorescent green, filling with something that looked almost like recognition. It knew him. It remembered him from the tent, from the blow he had dealt with the chromatograph, and it was coming for him with a personal, deliberate intent that was more terrifying than any mindless predation could have been. "Close your eyes," Zack commanded, his finger finding the trigger. "Sarah, close your eyes and cover your ears, now." He fired. The flare erupted with a sound like the world tearing in half, a detonation of white-hot magnesium brilliance that turned the narrow canyon into a furnace of blinding light. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. The green bioluminescence of the Ropen was utterly obliterated by the flare's radiance, drowned in a sea of searing white that burned afterimages into Zack's closed eyelids and heated the limestone walls to a temperature he could feel through his clothes. The creature screamed, a harmonic, multi-toned shriek of agony that seemed to come from every direction at once, and the canyon shook with the violence of its reaction. Zack forced his eyes open, blinking against the purple afterimages that danced across his vision, and saw the Ropen thrashing in the passage, its head thrown back, its claws raking against the stone in spasms of blind panic. The flare had worked. The intense light had overwhelmed its hyperdeveloped night vision, plunging the creature into a world of white-hot pain and sensory chaos. But the effect was temporary. Already, the creature was recovering, its head swiveling in their direction, its beak snapping with renewed fury. "The rock slide," Sarah shouted, pointing upward at a section of the canyon wall where the limestone had been fractured by the flare's heat and the creature's thrashing. "Zack, the wall." He saw it immediately, a geological fault line that had been destabilized by the vibrations, a section of cliff face that hung in precarious balance above the passage. If he could trigger it, if he could bring those tons of limestone crashing down into the narrowest section of the canyon, he could trap the creature, pin it, maybe even kill it. Zack grabbed the machete from his belt, its dull blade gleaming in the fading light of the flare, and he attacked the fault line with everything he had. Each blow sent chips of stone flying, each impact sending vibrations up his arms that made his joints scream in protest. The creature was recovering faster now, its clicking sounds returning, its head lowering to assess the situation with that terrible alien intelligence. It could see him, he realized. Even blinded, even in pain, it could sense his position through sound, through vibration, through some sense that humans didn't possess. The beak struck. It came with the speed of a guillotine blade, extending through the constriction with a snap that made the air whistle. Sarah threw herself backward, the beak missing her face by centimeters, the needle-sharp teeth grazing her cheek and leaving a line of blood that looked black in the dim light. She screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, and scrabbled further into the passage, pressing herself against the far wall. "Zack," she shrieked, "it's going to get us." "Not yet," Zack grunted, bringing the machete down with a final, desperate blow. The fault line gave way with a sound like thunder, like the earth itself clearing its throat. The section of cliff face that had hung in precarious balance for millennia surrendered to gravity in a cascading avalanche of limestone blocks and powdered rock. The first boulder struck the creature's extended wing with an impact that Zack felt in his molars, and the Ropen's scream rose to a frequency that made his nose bleed and his vision blur at the edges. More rocks followed, tons of limestone, ancient and heavy, crashing down into the narrowest section of the canyon in a controlled demolition that buried the creature's left wing beneath a pile of debris that would have crushed a truck. The creature thrashed, its good wing beating against the walls with blows that sent shockwaves through the passage, its tail whipping back and forth in a frenzy of pain and rage. But it was trapped. The rocks held it, pinned it, denied it the aerial superiority that was its greatest weapon. "Go," Zack grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her away from the pinned creature, away from the constriction, deeper into the canyon where the passage widened again, and offered a route that led upward toward the ridgeline and eventually the coast. "Don't look back, just run." They ran. Behind them, the creature's screams gradually faded into a rhythmic, grinding clicking that spoke not of hunting but of entrapment, of a predator that had become prey to the very geology it had tried to exploit. The sound followed them for kilometers, echoing off the canyon walls, a reminder that the Ropen was patient, that it was eternal, that it would eventually free itself from the stone that held it. But not tonight. Tonight, Zach and Sarah ran through the remaining darkness with the desperate energy of the reprieved, following drainage channels and natural terraces that led them ever upward, ever outward, toward the distant sound of the sea. They emerged from the karst region as dawn was breaking, the first gray light of morning painting the eastern sky in shades of pearl and rose. The ridgeline they had sought was behind them now, a jagged spine of volcanic basalt that marked the boundary between the interior and the coast. Before them, the land sloped downward in a series of forested terraces that eventually gave way to mangrove swamps, and beyond those, the glittering expanse of the coral sea. They found the fishing vessel at midday, a small outrigger canoe with a diesel engine that coughed and sputtered its way along the coast in search of reef fish and lobster. The fishermen, two brothers from a coastal village who spoke a dialect that Sarah could barely understand, looked at their bedraggled state with expressions of sympathetic concern. They didn't ask questions. In this part of the world, people who emerged from the interior jungle in the middle of the night, covered in blood and limestone dust and the thousand-yard stare of trauma, were best helped without interrogation. The brothers gave them water and dried fish and a blanket to share in the narrow bow of the canoe. And as the little vessel chugged its way southward along the coast, following the migration patterns of the tuna schools, Zach and Sarah sat in silence, watching the shoreline recede into a green blur of jungle and cliff. It was Sarah who saw them first. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of amber and violet, casting long shadows across the canopy of the interior highlands. And on the highest peaks, silhouetted against the fading light, points of luminescence were beginning to appear. One, then two, then five, then a dozen. Neon green, pulsing in slow, rhythmic synchrony, like signal fires, like lighthouses, like eyes opening in the darkness to watch the sea. "Zach," Sarah whispered, her hand finding his in the darkness of the boat. "Zach, look." He looked and he understood. They hadn't awakened one Ropen. They had signaled an entire colony. The resins Vance had stolen, the ancient preservatives they had exposed to the air, the chemical signature they had broadcast across the jungle. It had been a message, a dinner bell, a declaration that the long-sealed burial grounds had been disturbed and that the guardians were needed. The creatures on the peaks were not hunting. Not yet. They were watching, waiting, marking the passage of the little fishing boat as it carried the survivors away from their domain. And Zach knew with a certainty that settled in his gut like a stone that the scent of those resins clung to them still. It was in their clothes, in their hair, in the pores of their skin. They carried the chemical signature of disturbance with them, a trail that could be followed across water, across distance, across time itself. "Will they come?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the diesel engine's chugging rhythm. Zach watched the green lights on the peaks, counting them, memorizing their positions. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but they've waited millions of years, Sarah. What's a few decades to something that old?" The sun dipped below the horizon, and the green lights blazed brighter in the sudden darkness, a constellation of emerald stars that marked the boundary between the world of humans and the world of ancient things that humans had never learned to understand. Zach pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, feeling the chill of the ocean wind and the deeper chill of a knowledge that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had survived. Sarah had survived. But they had left something behind in that jungle, something more than equipment and ambition and the ruined careers of disgraced academics. They had left a door open, a signal sent, a debt incurred that would one day inevitably come due. The fishing boat chugged onward into the gathering night, carrying them toward the lights of civilization and the illusion of safety. But behind them, on the highest peaks of the limestone karst, the neon gravekeepers continued their patient vigil, their bioluminescence pulsing in the darkness like the heartbeat of an ancient and terrible world that had never stopped watching, never stopped waiting, never stopped collecting the debts of the living. And somewhere in the darkness, the clicking continued. The debriefing took place 3 weeks later, in a sterile conference room at the Australian consulate in Port Moresby. The officials who conducted the interview, a representative from the Department of Foreign Affairs, a liaison officer from the Papua New Guinea government, and a man who identified himself only as Dr. Ashford, and who wore no institutional affiliation, listened to Zach's account with expressions that ranged from skeptical concern to barely concealed disbelief. They had found the camp, or what remained of it. They had found the tent, collapsed and torn. They had found blood samples that matched the DNA of Dr. Marcus Vance, Dr. Elena Vasquez, and James Park. They had found a chromatograph, dented and bloodied, lying in the leaf litter approximately 50 meters from the tent. What they had not found, what no search party, no helicopter survey, no ground expedition had been able to locate, was any evidence of the creature Zach described. "You're asking us to believe," the man called Ashford said, his voice smooth and clinical, "that a previously unknown species of flying reptile, with a wingspan exceeding 8 meters and bioluminescent capabilities, has been living in the limestone karst of Papua New Guinea for millions of years, without a single verified sighting by any scientific expedition." "I'm not asking you to believe anything," Zach replied, his voice flat and exhausted. "I'm telling you what happened, what killed 4 people, what would have killed 6 if we hadn't gotten lucky." "Luck," Ashford repeated, making a notation on his tablet. "An interesting choice of words. The local authorities have a different theory. They believe your team disturbed a sacred burial site, that you stole artifacts of significant cultural value, and that the subsequent deaths were the result of panic, disorientation, and probable homicide committed by Dr. Vance before he himself perished in the jungle." "Vance didn't kill anyone," Sarah said from beside Zach. She had been largely silent throughout the interview, her face pale and drawn, her hands folded in her lap in a posture of rigid control. "We saw what killed them. We saw it. We smelled it. We felt the wind from its wings. You can invent whatever narrative makes your government comfortable, but that doesn't change what actually happened out there." Ashford smiled, a thin, professional expression that conveyed no warmth. "Miss Chen, your academic record suggests a predisposition toward what might charitably be called alternative interpretations of indigenous folklore. Your thesis on cryptid ethnography was rejected by 3 separate peer review boards. It's not unreasonable to suggest that your experiences in the jungle were filtered through a pre-existing psychological framework that interpreted natural phenomena, perhaps a large species of bat, or an undocumented bird of prey, through the lens of supernatural narrative." Zach stood up, his chair scraping against the tile floor with a sound like a scream. "We're done here," he said. "You can write whatever report you want. You can blame Vance or blame us or blame the weather, but I'm telling you this, don't send anyone else into that karst. Don't let anyone disturb those burial sites. And if you see a green light in the jungle at night, any green light, anywhere, you run. You run until your lungs bleed, and then you keep running." They were escorted from the building by security guards who were polite but firm, deposited on the hot sidewalk outside with the finality of men who had been judged and found wanting. Sarah stood in the tropical sun, her face tilted upward, her eyes closed against the glare, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "They'll go back," she said finally. "You know that, right? They'll send another expedition, someone from Ashford's organization or a private company or a military unit. They'll want samples. They'll want proof. They'll want to capture it." "I know," Zach said. "And it'll kill them, all of them, just like it killed Vance, just like it killed Vasquez and Park." "I know." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him, and in her gaze Zack saw the same thing he felt in his own chest, a weariness that went beyond exhaustion, a knowledge that would never find official acknowledgement, a burden that would never be shared or understood by the world they were returning to. "What do we do?" she asked. Zack considered the question for a long time, watching the traffic pass on the dusty street, listening to the sounds of a city that existed in a reality where monsters were myths and the dark held no special terrors. He thought about the green lights on the peaks, about the clicking in the darkness, about the patient, eternal hunger of something that had been collecting specimens since before humans learned to fear the night. "We remember," he said finally. "We remember exactly what happened. We write it down. We tell anyone who will listen. And when they don't listen, when they send their expeditions and their cameras and their guns, we stand back and we watch. Because the Ropen has been hunting that jungle for 1,000,000 years, Sarah, and in all that time it has never met a human it couldn't collect." They walked together down the street, two survivors in a world that had no room for their truth, carrying the scent of ancient resins and limestone dust and something else, something that no shower could wash away, no distance could diminish. The clicking followed them, not in reality but in memory, a rhythmic tattoo that played in the spaces between heartbeats, in the silence before sleep, in the darkness behind closed eyelids. Months later, Zack would receive a package in the mail. No return address, no explanation, just a single object wrapped in layers of wax paper and packed in a box of crushed bamboo fiber. It was a tooth, approximately 12 centimeters long, curved like a scythe, its surface striated with microscopic grooves that caught the light and refracted it into faint, impossible shades of emerald green. There was no note, no message, but Zack knew with the absolute certainty of a man who has looked into the eyes of eternity, who had sent it and why. It was not a threat. It was a reminder, a calling card from a collector who had marked him as a specimen of particular interest, who had let him go but not forgotten him, who was waiting with the patience of geological time for the moment when the trail of resins would lead back across the ocean, back to the source of the disturbance, back to the final addition, to a collection that spanned millennia. Zack placed the tooth in a glass case on his desk, where it caught the afternoon light and seemed to glow with its own internal luminescence. And every night, as the sun set and the darkness gathered in the corners of his apartment, he would sit before that case and listen. Sometimes, if the wind was right and the city sounds faded to their lowest ebb, he could hear it, faint, distant, undeniable. Click, 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 click. The sound of something patient, something eternal, something that had all the time in the world and that knew with absolute certainty that he was only borrowing his freedom. The neon grave was waiting, and one day, without warning, the collector would come to claim what had been marked as its own. The scent of old leather. The leather-bound journal lay open in the mud, its pages swollen with moisture, the gilt edges of the paper darkened to a color resembling dried blood. Rain had fallen in the night, a tropical downpour that had transformed the forest floor into a soup of decaying leaves and eroded laterite, and the journal had been deposited in this particular patch of muck by forces that would not become clear until much later, when the survivors, if there were to be survivors, had time to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led them to this moment, this place, this artifact that spoke more eloquently of doom than any scream could have done. The cover was calf leather, the kind of high-end binding that bespoke affluence and education, and the kind of casual relationship with material possessions that comes from never having needed to worry about the cost of things. The pages were thick, handmade stock, watermarked with the logo of a Florentine stationer that had been crafting blank books for scholars and dreamers since the Renaissance. And on the page that lay exposed to the elements, circled in red ink that had begun to bleed and feather in the damp, was a single sentence written in a precise, architectural hand. "The smell is the only warning you get." There was no context, No preceding paragraph, no following explanation, no marginal notation that might have clarified whether the sentence was an observation, a warning, or the final thought of a mind that had encountered something beyond the capacity of language to describe. There was only the sentence, the red circle, and the mud, and there was the sound. It came from somewhere in the ferns that bordered the clearing where the journal lay, a wet, rhythmic dragging that suggested something heavy moving through vegetation, with a deliberation that was more terrible than any speed could have been. The sound was not continuous. It came in intervals, punctuated by silences that were somehow more oppressive than the noise itself, as if the thing that made the sound were pausing to listen, to scent the air, to confirm that its path was clear and its prey was unaware. The ferns swayed in patterns that did not match the wind, their fronds bending and parting as something passed beneath them, something that moved close to the ground but was large enough to disturb the canopy above, sending droplets of rainwater cascading down in a secondary rain that pattered against the journal's pages and diluted the red ink into pink rivulets that ran like diluted blood across the handmade paper. The thing in the ferns paused. The dragging sound ceased, and for a long moment the only noise in the clearing was the steady drip of water from the canopy and the distant, insectal drone of the forest's eternal background hum. Then the smell came. It was not a sudden smell. It was not the sharp, unmistakable assault of a corpse discovered in a closed room. It was a gradual emergence, a creeping revelation that unfolded across the olfactory landscape like a fog rolling in from the sea, displacing the existing sense of the jungle with a presence that was older, more fundamental, and infinitely more wrong. The lush, complex perfume of the tropical forest, the sweet rot of fallen fruit, the sharp green of crushed ferns, the musk of unseen animals, the floral explosion of orchids and heliconias that opened their petals to the dawn, all of it was slowly, inexorably being overwritten by something else. Something that smelled like leather left too long in a damp cellar. Something that smelled like the breath of a carnivore that had not eaten in weeks. Something that smelled like a python that had died in the noonday sun and been left to bloat and liquefy in the equatorial heat, its tissues breaking down into a sulfuric miasma that combined the chemical sharpness of rotting meat with an underlying sweetness that was more disturbing than any straightforward corruption could have been. The smell was the only warning, and the journal, lying open in the mud with its red-circled sentence dissolving in the rain, had tried to tell them. 3 days earlier, the expedition had assembled in the lobby of a boutique hotel in Accra, Ghana's capital, where the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the humidity, and the concierge regarded the 6 foreigners with the polite skepticism of a man who had seen too many wealthy amateurs embark on adventures they were not equipped to survive. The group had been selected by a tour company that specialized in transformational wilderness experiences for clients who possessed more money than sense, a demographic that the company's marketing materials described as discerning adventurers seeking authentic engagement with pristine ecosystems. The 6 members of the expedition represented a cross-section of the developed world's comfortable elite, united by their desire to purchase authenticity and their shared inability to recognize the contradiction inherent in that pursuit. There was Dr. Eleanor Vance, an anthropologist from Oxford whose research on West African funeral traditions had brought her academic renown, but whose field experience consisted primarily of supervised interviews in air-conditioned government offices. There was her husband, Richard Vance, a venture capitalist whose interest in the expedition had been sparked by a TED Talk about reconnecting with our primal selves, and who had spent the flight from London complaining about the lack of champagne in business class. There was Marcus Webb, a travel journalist whose assignment was to document the untouched wilderness for a lifestyle magazine whose readers equated suffering with authenticity and authenticity with social capital. There was Priya Sharma, a Silicon Valley executive who had recently completed a vision quest in Patagonia and was seeking the next level of transformational experience to post about on her social media accounts. There was Tomás Herrera, a Spanish architect who collected extreme experiences with the same meticulous attention to detail that he brought to his building designs, cataloging each adventure in leather-bound journals identical to the one that would eventually end up in the mud. And there was Kofi, the local guide who had been assigned to the expedition by the tour company's Ghanaian partners, a man in his 50s whose face bore the scars of a lifetime spent navigating the forests and savannas of West Africa's interior, whose eyes held a depth of knowledge that no amount of academic study could replicate, and whose initial briefing to the group had been met with the polite condescension of people who believed that technology and money had rendered local knowledge obsolete. Kofi had stood before them in the hotel lobby, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert, and he had explained the rules of the forest with a gravity that should have commanded their full attention. He had spoken in English that was fluent but formal, the product of a colonial education system that had taught him the language of power, while systematically devaluing the indigenous knowledge that was his birthright. "The forest we will enter is not like the parks in your countries," he had said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "It is not managed. It is not safe. It is not a place for recreation or photography or the collection of stories to tell at dinner parties. It is a place with rules, rules that were established long before your scientists gave names to the animals, long before your governments drew lines on maps, long before your ancestors learned to build walls between themselves and the wild." "We're quite experienced, actually," Richard Vance had interrupted, adjusting the fit of his expensive hiking boots with the air of a man who believed that equipment could substitute for wisdom. "Eleanor has done field work in Botswana. I've summited Kilimanjaro. We're not tourists, Mr. Kofi. We're adventurers." Kofi had looked at Richard with an expression that might have been pity or might have been contempt, the two emotions being so closely related in his experience that he no longer bothered to distinguish between them. "The mountain does not care what you have climbed," he had said. "The forest does not care what you have studied. The rules are not suggestions. They are not guidelines. They are the conditions of survival, and if you break them, you will not return to tell anyone what you have seen." He had listed the rules then, counting them on his fingers with the deliberation of a man reciting sacred texts. 1. Stay on the path. The forest trails had been established over centuries by people who understood the terrain, who knew which routes were safe and which led to places where humans were not welcome. 2. Do not call out to voices in the brush. The forest was full of sounds that mimicked human speech. Birds, primates whined through hollow trees, and responding to them was a way of announcing your presence to things that hunted by sound. 3. If you smell rotting meat where there is no carcass, stop moving. Do not run. Do not hide. Simply stop and wait for Kofi's signal, because the smell meant that the wind had shifted and they were now downwind of something that had been waiting for them to make exactly that mistake. "What kind of something?" Priya Sharma had asked, her fingers already composing the social media post she would write about the wise local guide and his superstitious forest rules. Kofi had hesitated. The pause had been brief, barely a heartbeat, but a leaner Vance, trained to observe human behavior, had noticed it. "The Kikiyaon," Kofi had said finally, the word emerging from his lips with a reluctance that suggested he was breaking a taboo even by speaking it aloud. "The owl that is not an owl, the collector of breath, the thing that leaves the body but takes the spirit." "A local legend," Tomás Herrera had said, making a notation in his leather-bound journal with a fountain pen that seemed absurdly elegant for the context. "Every region has them. Big cats that are actually shapeshifters, birds that carry the souls of the dead. They're metaphors, surely, psychological frameworks for understanding the dangers of the wilderness." "Metaphors do not leave bodies behind," Kofi had replied, his voice flat and cold. "Metaphors do not make the sounds that the Kikiyaon makes. Metaphors do not smell like the Kikiyaon smells. You may believe what you wish, but the forest does not care what you believe. The Kikiyaon does not care what you believe, and I do not care what you believe. I care only that you follow the rules so that I do not have to carry your bodies back to the hotel." The briefing had ended with handshakes and assurances that bordered on condescension, with Richard Vance slipping Kofi a tip that was generous enough to be insulting, and with the group dispersing to their respective rooms to prepare their gear for the morning's departure. Tamaz had written in his journal that evening, sitting at the hotel bar with a glass of single malt whiskey, recording his impressions of the guide and his charming but clearly exaggerated folklore. He had circled a sentence near the end of the entry, a sentence that he had intended to expand upon when he had more time, more data, more understanding of the context in which the warnings had been delivered. The smell is the only warning you get. He had not known, as he wrote those words, that they would be the last complete sentence he would commit to paper. He had not known that the journal would survive him, that it would end up in the mud as a message to whoever might find it, that the red circle he had drawn around the words would become a prophecy and an epitaph. The trek had begun with the bright optimism of the ignorant. They had traveled by land rover to the edge of the protected forest, a reserve that existed on maps but was barely managed in practice, a zone where the authority of the central government gave way to the older jurisdictions of tradition and taboo. They had hiked for 2 days through terrain that was challenging but not impossible, following trails that Kofi navigated with an ease that spoke of decades of familiarity. The group had been in high spirits, their expensive gear gleaming in the filtered sunlight, their cameras clicking constantly as they documented the authentic wilderness experience that they would later curate into narratives of personal growth and transformative challenge. Kofi had watched them with the patient sadness of a man who has seen this story play out too many times to believe that the ending could be changed. He had tried to enforce the rules, had insisted on a pace that kept them on the established trails, had refused to allow evening excursions beyond the campsite perimeter. But the group had chafed against his restrictions, had complained about his caution, had treated his warnings as entertainment rather than instruction. "He's so dramatic," Priya had whispered to a leaner on the second night, as Kofi sat apart from the group, his face turned toward the darkness beyond the firelight. "It's like he's trying to scare us on purpose, probably part of the experience package, authentic local color." "He's frightened," Eleanor had replied, surprising herself with the observation. "Not of the forest, of us, of what we'll do when he isn't looking." She had been right, but the understanding had come too late. The third day had dawned clear and hot, the humidity building to a pressure that seemed to compress the air into something solid and suffocating. They had broken camp early, Kofi pushing for a pace that would carry them through the most dangerous section of the trail before nightfall, and the group had complied with the sullen resentment of children forced to finish their vegetables. The forest had been beautiful that morning, the canopy creating a cathedral of green that filtered the sunlight into patterns of emerald and gold, the undergrowth thick with life that buzzed and chirped and rustled, with the exuberance of an ecosystem that had never learned to fear human intrusion. But the beauty had been fading by midday, and not because of any change in the environment. The forest was as lush, as vibrant, as teeming with life as it had been in the morning. What had changed was the smell. Eleanor noticed it first, her anthropologist's training attuning her to subtle shifts in sensory environments. They had been walking for approximately 4 hours when she had realized that the floral perfume of the jungle, the complex, layered scent of heliconias and orchids, and the subtle sweetness of crushed ferns, had been replaced by something else. Something that clung to the back of the throat with a chemical insistence that suggested not natural decay but unnatural corruption. "Does anyone else smell that?" she had asked, her voice cutting through the group's desultory conversation about lunch schedules and photographic lighting. "Smell what?" Richard had replied, his attention focused on adjusting the settings of his drone controller. "That, sulfur like rotten eggs or spoiled meat." The others had stopped, their nostrils flaring as they sampled the air with the sudden alertness of animals who have detected a change in their environment but do not yet understand its significance. Marcus Webb had made a face, his features contorting in an expression of theatrical disgust. Jesus, something's dead nearby. Probably a monkey fell out of a tree, or one of those forest pigs got taken by a leopard. That's not a leopard kill, Kofi had said, and his voice had been so changed, so stripped of its usual patience, so raw with fear, that the group had turned to look at him with expressions of genuine alarm for the first time since the expedition had begun. The guide had been standing at the edge of the trail, his body rigid, his face turned into the wind with a concentration that suggested he was reading information in the air that the others could not perceive. His skin, normally a rich brown that seemed to absorb the forest light, had gone ashen, a pallor that spoke of blood draining from the surface tissues in preparation for fight or flight. "Kofi," Elinor had said, her voice uncertain. "What is it? What's wrong?" "The wind," Kofi had whispered, the words emerging as if forced through a throat that had forgotten how to speak. "The wind has shifted. We are downwind." "Downwind of what?" Richard had demanded, his tone reverting to the entitled impatience that he used when service personnel failed to meet his expectations. Kofi had not answered. He had turned slowly, his movements exaggerated with a carefulness that suggested he was trying to avoid making any sudden motions that might attract attention. His eyes had scanned the canopy above them, moving from tree to tree with a methodical precision that was more disturbing than any panicked searching could have been. Because panic meant uncertainty, and Kofi's scanning had the quality of absolute certainty, the behavior of a man who knows exactly what he is looking for and is praying that he will not find it. "We must stop," he had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone, stop moving, stop speaking, stop breathing if you can." "This is ridiculous," Richard had said, but there had been a tremor in his voice that betrayed the fear he was trying to suppress. "It's a bad smell, probably a dead animal. We'll walk around it." "You do not walk around the Kikiyaon," Kofi had said, and the name had emerged with a weight that made the air around them seem colder. "You do not walk around it, and you do not walk away from it. You stop. You become silent. You become still. You become dead in every way that matters, and you pray that it is not hungry enough to investigate a corpse." "The Kikiyaon," Tamaz had repeated, his hand finding his journal, his fingers closing around the pen with a tightness that suggested he was trying to anchor himself to something familiar. "The owl thing you mentioned, Kofi, that's folklore, mythology. It's not real." The guide had looked at him with an expression that Tamaz would remember for the rest of his life, a look that contained no anger, no contempt, no desire to convince or persuade. Only pity, only resignation, only the weary knowledge of a man who has tried to save people from themselves and has failed too many times to believe that this group will be any different. "It is real enough to smell," Kofi had said, "and if you can smell it, then it can smell you. Your fear, your sweat, the carbon dioxide of your breath. You are not prey because you are weak. You are prey because you are alive. And the Kikiyaon collects life the way you collect experiences, Mr. Herrera, the way you fill your books with stories. It is not hunger, it is not survival, it is collection, it is curation, it is the accumulation of souls for purposes that no human has ever survived long enough to understand." The group had fallen silent then, the reality of Kofi's fear finally penetrating their armor of skepticism and privilege. They had stood in the middle of the trail, 6 affluent tourists and their terrified guide, surrounded by a forest that had suddenly ceased to be a backdrop for their adventure and had become something else entirely, a predatory environment that regarded them with the patient, ancient hunger of an ecosystem that had never accepted human dominance. And the smell had grown stronger. It was not the smell of a single dead animal. That had become clear as the minutes passed and the odor intensified. It was the smell of corruption on a massive scale, a miasma that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, saturating the air with a density that made breathing an act of will rather than reflex. The sulfuric notes had deepened, acquiring an undertone of ammonia that stung the eyes and a sweetness that was more disturbing than any straightforward foulness could have been. It was the smell of a python that had swallowed something too large to digest and had died with the meal still rotting in its gut. It was the smell of a carnivore's den, accumulated over decades of feeding, layered with the chemical signatures of countless deaths. It was the smell of a predator that did not clean itself, that wore its kills like perfume, that announced its presence to the world with an olfactory signature that said, simply and terrifyingly, "I am here, and I am coming." "Kofi," Elinor had whispered, her hand finding her husband's arm and gripping it with a strength that would leave bruises. "Kofi, what do we do?" The guide had not answered. He had been staring upward into the canopy, his eyes fixed on a point that seemed to shimmer in the heat-distorted air between the canopy layers. And following his gaze, the others had seen it too, a shadow that was not cast by any visible source, a darkness that moved against the wind, a shape that was roughly the size of a man but was somehow wrong in its proportions, too broad, too heavy, trailing something that caught the light in metallic flashes. "It is above us," Kofi had breathed, the words barely audible. "It has been above us since morning, waiting for the wind to shift, waiting for us to come into range." "Then we run," Richard had said, his voice cracking. "We run back to the trailhead, we run to the Land Rover, we—" "No," Kofi's hand had shot out, gripping Richard's wrist with a strength that made the venture capitalist gasp. "You do not run from the Kikiyaon. Running is what it wants. Running is the signal that tells it you are prey. If you run, you die. If you stay still, if you become silent, if you make yourself dead. There is a chance, a small chance, the only chance." They had stood there, frozen in the middle of the trail, 6 humans and their guide trying to become invisible through sheer force of will. The smell had intensified until it was a physical presence, a weight that pressed against their faces and filled their lungs with each shallow, terrified breath. And above them, in the canopy that suddenly seemed too thin, too penetrable, too utterly inadequate as protection, something had been moving. Something heavy. Something patient. Something that smelled like rotting snake and old leather, and the accumulated deaths of centuries. The hunt had begun. The scream came from the canopy approximately 15 meters above their heads, and it was a sound that no human throat should have been able to produce. It began as a high, wet shriek that suggested air being forced through a throat constricted by external pressure. The exact sound, Elinor Vance would realize later, of a man being choked to death by hands that were not hands but something else entirely, something taloned and merciless. But the scream did not end in the gurgling dissolution of a strangulation victim. It modulated, transformed, became something that was simultaneously more and less than human, a rising keen that carried harmonics of genuine terror, a performance of dying that was so perfectly executed it bypassed the analytical centers of the brain and went directly to the amygdala, triggering a panic response that was older than language, older than civilization, older than the human species itself. "Jesus Christ," Marcus Webb had gasped, his hand fumbling for the camera that hung around his neck, his journalist instincts warring with a terror that was rapidly overwhelming every professional imperative. "Someone's up there. Someone's being attacked." "No," Kofi had said, but his voice had been lost in the sudden eruption of movement and sound from the group. Richard Vance had already been running, his expensive hiking boots pounding against the trail in a rhythm of panicked urgency, his body surging forward with the misplaced heroism of a man who had never been confronted with genuine danger, and had therefore never learned that courage without wisdom was simply another form of suicide. "Richard," Elinor had screamed, her fingers releasing her husband's arm as he bolted into the undergrowth. "Richard, come back, it's not human." But Richard had not heard. Or if he had heard, the words had not penetrated the adrenaline fog that had dissolved his reason into a primitive compulsion to act, to save, to be the hero that his self-image demanded. He had crashed through the ferns and saplings that bordered the trail, his arms windmilling against the branches that clawed at his face and clothing, his eyes fixed on the canopy where the scream had originated, his mind already composing the narrative of his bravery. I heard the cry for help, and I didn't hesitate. I ran toward the danger when others ran away. I was ready to risk my life for a stranger. He had reached a clearing approximately 20 meters from the trail, a natural break in the canopy where a fallen giant had created a window in the forest roof, allowing sunlight to pour down in a golden column that illuminated the clearing with an almost theatrical intensity. And in that column of light, suspended approximately 10 meters above the ground, was the source of the scream. It was not a man. Richard had seen it clearly in the instant before the downdraft struck him, had seen the shape that hung in the shaft of sunlight with the lazy rotation of a meat hook in a butcher's shop. It was a body, or the remains of one, but it was not the body of a living victim being attacked. It was a lure, a bait. A carefully preserved and positioned specimen that the Kikiyaon had hung in the light to attract the curious, the brave, the foolish. The body was that of a forest antelope, or what had once been an antelope, now reduced to a husk of skin and bone that had been emptied of everything that had once made it alive. The eyes were gone, replaced by hollow sockets that seemed to stare directly at Richard with an accusation that transcended species. The mouth was open in a rictus grin that suggested the final moments had been spent in an agony of understanding. And the throat had been modified somehow, the larynx exposed and manipulated, the vocal cords preserved and dried and positioned to catch the wind in a way that produced the exact frequency of a human scream. Richard had opened his mouth to scream himself, to warn the others, to announce that they had been deceived, that the danger was not where they thought it was but was instead exactly where they were standing. But before the sound could emerge, the downdraft had struck. It was not wind. It was something more specific, more directed, more terrifying in its precision. A column of displaced air that slammed into the clearing with the force of a falling elevator, driven by the passage of something massive moving through the space above at a speed that suggested not flight but controlled falling. The pressure wave had knocked Richard flat, driving him into the leaf litter with a violence that expelled the air from his lungs and made his vision explode into a constellation of white sparks. He had lain there, dazed and breathless, staring upward through the gap in the canopy at a sky that was suddenly, impossibly, occupied. The Kikiyaon had descended through the clearing with a speed that made it seem to materialize rather than arrive, as if it had been present all along and had simply chosen to reveal itself. Richard's first impression, the only impression his traumatized nervous system would retain, was of scale. The creature was enormous. Its wingspan, stretched in the moment of breaking, exceeded 6 meters, the membranous surfaces catching the sunlight and turning it into something that resembled stained glass, translucent panels veined with structures that were not feathers but something else. Something that suggested the wings of a bat, crossed with the wings of an owl, crossed with something that had evolved in a world where the rules of aerodynamics were suggestions rather than laws. But it was the head that Richard would carry with him into death, the image that would be his final conscious thought before the darkness took him. The head was owl-like, yes, but wrong in ways that made the comparison almost insulting to actual owls. It was man-sized, for one thing, the skull massive and domed, covered in short, dense feathers that shifted color between gray and green in a way that suggested camouflage capabilities beyond anything in the known animal kingdom. The eyes were enormous, filling most of the facial surface, and they were not the dark, liquid eyes of a nocturnal predator. They were pale, almost white, with pupils that contracted in the sunlight into vertical slits that seemed to contain no bottom, no limit, no boundary between observer and observed. And the beak. The beak was a nightmare of curved bone, longer than a man's forearm, its tip hooked like a scythe. its edges serrated with ridges that caught the light and refracted it into rainbow patterns that were almost beautiful in their deadliness. The beak was open as the creature descended, and Richard had seen, in the instant before impact, that the interior was lined with rows of backward-curving teeth that had no business existing in any avian skull, teeth that suggested the Kikiyaon was not a bird at all, but something that wore bird shape as a disguise, a costume, a hunting strategy that had evolved over millennia to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of primate prey. The impact had been a single, wet thud that echoed through the clearing, with a finality that suggested not violence but completion. The Kikiyaon had struck Richard with its talons, not the delicate grasping digits of an owl but massive, jointed claws that punched through his chest with the ease of a pitchfork through compost, lifting him from the ground in a single, fluid motion that suggested he weighed nothing, that his 80 kilograms of muscle and bone and ambition were as insignificant as a leaf in a hurricane. The creature had not paused. It had not savored the kill. It had simply collected him, ascending through the canopy gap with 3 powerful beats of its immense wings, and vanished into the green roof of the forest with its prize clutched against its feathered breast. Elinor had seen it all. She had been running after Richard, had been approximately 5 meters behind him when the downdraft had struck, had been knocked off her feet by the pressure wave but had retained enough consciousness to witness the final moments of her husband's life. She had seen the creature descend. She had seen it take him. And she had seen, in the instant before the canopy closed above them, the way Richard's body had hung in the creature's grip, not struggling, not screaming, but limp and empty, as if something essential had been removed in the moment of contact, leaving behind only a husk that resembled a human being without actually being one anymore. Richard! The scream had torn itself from her throat before she could stop it, a sound of pure, animal grief that was immediately answered by a chorus of voices from the rest of the group, everyone shouting at once, everyone trying to process what they had seen, everyone failing because what they had seen was not processable, was not compatible with any mental model of reality that they had ever constructed. "Shut up," Kofi had bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos with a violence that was shocking in its intensity. "Shut up, all of you, be silent." The command had been so unexpected, so forceful, that the group had obeyed before their conscious minds could override the reflex. They had fallen silent, 6 humans frozen in various postures of shock and terror, their eyes wide, their mouths open, their bodies trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. Kofi had moved among them with a speed that belied his age, his hands clamping over mouths, his body pressing them down into the undergrowth, his whispered commands urgent and absolute. "Down, flat, do not move, do not speak, do not breathe if you can help it. The Kikiyaon has taken one. It will not be satisfied with one. It will circle. It will wait. It will listen for the sounds of panic, and when it hears them, it will come again." "We have to help Richard," Elinor had whispered, but even as she spoke the words she had known they were meaningless. Richard was gone. Richard was dead, or worse than dead, and no amount of heroism could change that. "Your husband is not Richard anymore," Kofi had said, his voice gentler now but no less urgent. "The Kikiyaon does not eat flesh. Not primarily. Not first. It eats the essence. The soul, if you believe in such things. The life force, if you prefer scientific language. It consumes what makes a person alive and leaves the body as a shell, a container, a husk that resembles the original but contains nothing. Your husband's body may still be breathing. His heart may still be beating. But the thing that was Richard, the memories, the personality, the consciousness, that is gone, consumed, added to the Kikiyaon's collection." "That's insane," Tamaz had breathed, his face pressed against the damp leaf litter, his journal forgotten somewhere in the chaos of the attack. "That's not possible. That's not biology." "The Kikiyaon is not biology," Kofi had replied. "Not entirely. Not as you understand it. It is older than the categories that separate the living from the dead, the natural from the supernatural. It is a collector, a curator. It takes the essence of its victims and stores it somehow, preserves it in a form that we do not understand and cannot perceive. The scream you heard, that horrible, choked scream, was not a cry for help. It was the Kikiyaon's call, its hunting signal. It uses the preserved vocal cords of previous victims to produce a sound that draws the curious, the brave, the compassionate. It plays on the very instincts that make you human, and it turns those instincts against you. Then we don't respond, Priya had said, her voice shaking. We don't run toward the sound, we don't investigate, we just wait. Waiting will not save you, Kofi had said. The Kikiyaon is patient, but it is not passive. It has marked you now. It has scented you. It knows you are here and it knows you are prey. The question is not whether it will come again. The question is how it will choose to come. They had lain in the undergrowth for what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than 20 minutes. The forest had seemed to hold its breath around them, the normal sounds of insects and birds replaced by a silence that was more oppressive than any noise could have been. Elinor had pressed her face into the damp earth, her tears mixing with the soil, her body shaking with grief and terror in waves that threatened to overwhelm her consciousness entirely. She had been married to Richard for 12 years. They had built a life together, a career, a shared narrative of ambition and success, and the gradual accumulation of the markers that defined their class. And now he was gone. Not dead in any conventionally understood sense, but erased, consumed, reduced to a husk that hung somewhere in the canopy with all the other specimens the Kikiyaon had collected. "It's circling," Kofi had whispered, his eyes fixed on a point in the canopy that seemed to shimmer with a heat distortion that had nothing to do with temperature. "I can feel the wind, the downdraft. It is moving above us, searching." "Why doesn't it just take us all?" Marcus had asked, his voice barely audible. "If it's so powerful, why the games? Why the waiting?" "Because the waiting is part of the collection," Kofi had replied. "The Kikiyaon does not merely consume essence. It consumes fear. It consumes despair. It consumes the psychological breakdown that precedes the physical death. The longer you wait, the more you suffer, the more complete the meal becomes." The realization had settled over the group like a shroud. They were not just prey. They were livestock. They were being fattened on terror before the final consumption, their fear harvested as carefully as their lives would be. The herding had begun approximately 10 minutes after Richard's death. The Kikiyaon had not attacked directly. Instead, it had begun to move through the canopy in a slow, deliberate pattern, its massive wings creating pressure waves that stirred the leaves and branches in ways that were unmistakably intentional. The downdrafts had come in sequence, each one striking a different point around their hiding place, each one designed to drive them in a specific direction. The creature was not hunting them as a lion hunts gazelle. It was herding them, using its physical presence to channel their movement along paths that it had chosen, driving them toward terrain that offered maximum advantage to an aerial predator. "It's pushing us toward the ravine," Kofi had realized, his voice tight with a new fear that suggested the ravine was a destination worse than whatever they were fleeing from. "The narrow canyon. It knows we will seek shelter in confined spaces. It knows we will run for cover, and in the canyon there is no cover. There is only height, and the Kikiyaon rules the heights." "Then we don't go to the ravine," Tamaz had said. "We go anywhere else. We scatter." "If you scatter, you die alone," Kofi had replied. "If you stay together, you die together. The only hope, the only small, desperate hope, is to reach the stone outpost. The old colonial ruin 3 kilometers northeast, stone walls, iron doors. A structure built to withstand forces that no modern building could endure. If we can reach it, if we can barricade ourselves inside, if the Kikiyaon cannot find a way through." 3 kilometers, Priya had repeated, her voice hollow. "In open forest, while that thing hunts us from above." "Yes." They had moved as a group, maintaining a formation that was more psychological than tactical, clinging to each other for comfort and courage in equal measure. Kofi had taken the lead, his eyes constantly scanning the canopy, his body moving with a fluid grace that suggested he had done this before, had survived this before, had learned through terrible experience the specific patterns of movement that minimized the likelihood of detection. The others had followed as best they could. Elinor had moved like an automaton, her grief crystallized into a numb efficiency that allowed her to place one foot in front of the other without conscious thought. Marcus had stayed close to Tamaz, the two men forming an alliance of mutual protection that was as fragile as it was necessary. Priya had brought up the rear, her eyes fixed on the ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps that suggested she was on the verge of hyperventilation. The Kikiyaon had continued its herding, maintaining a distance that was close enough to keep them terrified but far enough to allow them to keep moving. The downdrafts had struck at intervals, each one precisely calculated to knock them off balance, to scatter their formation, to drive them toward the ravine that yawned ahead like a wound in the earth. The creature had not spoken, had not made any sound beyond the rush of its wings and the occasional wet, clicking noise that emerged from its beak as if it were tasting the air, sampling the chemical signatures of their fear. And then the shoulder spurs had appeared. Kofi had seen them first, glinting in a shaft of sunlight that penetrated the canopy at a particularly thin point. They were structures that extended from the creature's wings, not part of the wing membrane itself, but separate, specialized organs that served no aerodynamic purpose. Each spur was approximately 30 centimeters long, curved like a scimitar, its surface honed to a monomolecular edge that caught the light and refracted it into a rainbow of colors that suggested crystalline structure rather than keratin. The Kikiyaon used these spurs as weapons, Kofi had explained in a hurried whisper, diving through the canopy to slash at prey with a precision that could sever limbs or decapitate with a single pass. "The tents," Marcus had said, his voice breaking. "Our camp if we could reach the tents." "The tents are canvas," Kofi had replied. The Kikiyaon spurs slice through canvas like a knife through water. The tents offer no protection. They offer only the illusion of protection, which is worse than no protection at all. But they had reached the camp anyway, driven there by the creature's herding, funneled through the forest along paths that converged on the clearing where their tents still stood, pathetic monuments to their arrogance and their belief that the wilderness could be managed with money and equipment. The camp had been destroyed, not by the Kikiyaon, but by the downdrafts that had preceded them, the pressure waves knocking over equipment cases, scattering clothing and supplies, tearing the tent stakes from the ground, and sending the shelters billowing into the undergrowth like wounded birds. "The gear," Tamaz had said, making a move toward the scattered equipment. "We need water, we need food, we need—" A sound had cut him off, a wet, tearing sound that had emerged from directly above, accompanied by a rush of air that made the remaining tent fabric snap and flutter like a flag in a hurricane. The Kikiyaon had descended through the canopy, its wings folded against its body, its shoulder spurs extended like blades, and it had passed through the camp with a speed that made it seem to teleport rather than fly. The spurs had caught the largest tent, the one that had served as the communal shelter, and had sliced through it with a sound like a sheet being torn in half, the canvas parting along a clean line that suggested surgical precision rather than random violence. "Run!" Kofi had screamed, and the group had scattered. But the Kikiyaon had not been interested in the camp. It had been interested in them. And as they fled the clearing in different directions, the creature had chosen its next target with a selectivity that suggested preference, taste, discrimination. Marcus Webb had been the first to fall. The journalist had been running toward the tree line, his long legs carrying him faster than the others, his mind already composing the headline that he would never write: "Monster in the West African Forest, one man's terrifying encounter." He had been approximately 10 meters from the clearing when the downdraft had struck him from behind, a pressure wave that drove him face first into the ground with a force that broke his nose and split his lip. He had tried to rise, had gotten to his knees, had been reaching for a fallen branch that he intended to use as a weapon, when the shadow had fallen over him. The Kikiyaon had landed with a grace that was obscene in its perfection, its talons sinking into the leaf litter on either side of Marcus's body, its wings folding against its flanks with a whisper of membrane against membrane. Marcus had looked up, had seen the owl head descending toward him, had seen the pale eyes filling with something that might have been recognition or might have been satisfaction, and then the beak had opened and something had emerged. It was not a physical attack, not a bite, not a strike, not a piercing of flesh with those terrible serrated teeth. It was something else, something that Marcus would experience for the remaining seconds of his conscious existence as a sensation of being emptied, of being turned inside out, of having something essential extracted from his body with a precision that suggested not violence but surgery. The Kikiyaon's beak had hovered inches from his face, and a sound had emerged from within, a harmonic vibration that resonated in Marcus's chest cavity and skull, creating a standing wave that seemed to loosen the bonds between his cells, to dissolve the connections between his body and his consciousness. He had felt himself being pulled. Not physically, his body had remained in the leaf litter, his limbs twitching in spastic, uncoordinated movements, but spiritually, psychologically, existentially. Something was being drawn out of him, something that had no name in any human language but that he recognized with absolute certainty as the core of his being, the irreducible essence that made him Marcus Webb and not someone else, not something else. And as it was drawn out, as it was pulled into the Kikiyaon's waiting beak, he had felt a sensation that was worse than pain, worse than terror, worse than death. He had felt himself becoming smaller, diminishing, being reduced to a memory, a flavor, a note in a symphony that was older than the forest and larger than any individual life could comprehend. Then darkness, not the darkness of unconsciousness, but the darkness of non-existence, of being unmade, of having the light that was his selfhood extinguished and added to the collection of lights that the Kikiyaon carried within itself, a constellation of consumed souls that burned with a cold fire in the creature's unimaginable interior. His body had lain in the leaf litter, still breathing, still warm, still possessing the appearance of life. But the eyes had been empty. The face had been slack. The essence that had been Marcus Webb had been consumed, and what remained was a husk that would continue to function biologically for hours or days before the systems failed and the shell collapsed into decay. The others had seen it happen. They had been running, scattered, driven by panic and the desperate need to survive, but they had seen Marcus fall, had seen the Kikiyaon descend, had seen the journalist's body transform from a living human being into an empty container in the space of seconds. And they had understood with a clarity that needed no explanation that this was their fate. This was what awaited them. Not death, exactly, but something worse than death. Something that erased not just the body but the self, that reduced a human being to a biological artifact and added their consciousness to a collection that spanned centuries. "The ravine," Kofi had screamed, his voice carrying above the chaos. "Run for the ravine, it is the only chance." They had run. Elinor, Tamaz, Priya, and Kofi, 4 survivors from a group of 6, reduced by half in less than an hour. They had sprinted through the undergrowth, their lungs burning, their legs trembling, their bodies pushed beyond the limits of endurance by the adrenaline that was their only remaining defense against the despair that threatened to freeze them in place. The ravine had opened before them like a scar in the earth, a narrow cleft in the forest floor that plunged downward in a series of rocky steps before disappearing into shadow. The walls were steep, nearly vertical in places, composed of eroded laterite and volcanic rock that offered minimal handholds and maximum danger. But the ravine was narrow, less than 4 meters across at its widest point, and Kofi had known, with the desperate certainty of a man who has nothing left but hope, that the Kikiyaon's wingspan was too wide to allow it to enter. "Inside," he had commanded, herding them toward the cleft. Get inside, stay against the walls." They had scrambled down the rocky slope, their hands bleeding from sharp edges, their clothing tearing on the abrasive surfaces. Elinor had fallen once, her ankle twisting on a loose stone, and Tamaz had caught her, hauling her upright with a strength born of panic. Priya had descended in a controlled slide, her training as a yoga practitioner giving her a balance and flexibility that the others lacked. Kofi had brought up the rear, his eyes constantly scanning the sky, his body positioned to shield the others from whatever might descend from above. They had reached the bottom of the ravine approximately 3 minutes after entering it, pressing themselves against the walls in a ragged line of exhaustion and terror. Above them, the sky was a narrow strip of blue framed by the green walls of the forest, and on the rim of the ravine, perched with a patience that suggested it had all the time in the world, was the Kikiyaon. The creature had not attempted to follow them into the cleft. It had simply landed on the rim, its talons gripping the volcanic rock with a casual strength that suggested it could maintain its position indefinitely. Its wings were folded now, but the shoulder spurs remained extended, glinting in the sunlight like blades waiting to be used. And its eyes, those terrible, pale eyes, had fixed on the survivors with an intensity that suggested not hunger but curiosity, not predation but appraisal. "It can't get in," Tamaz had whispered, his voice cracked and dry. "The ravine is too narrow, its wings are too wide." "It cannot fly in," Kofi had agreed. "But it does not need to fly, it can wait, and it can reach." As if to illustrate his point, the Kikiyaon had extended one massive wing, stretching it across the gap of the ravine in a gesture that demonstrated the creature's reach. The membranous surface had not touched the opposite wall. The span was still too wide for that. But it had come close, close enough to make the point that the ravine was not a sanctuary but a postponement, a temporary delay of the inevitable. "What do we do?" Elinor had asked, her voice empty of everything but the mechanical need to continue asking questions, to continue planning, to continue hoping that somewhere in the universe of possibilities there existed an outcome that did not end with her body in the leaf litter and her essence consumed by the creature above. "We wait," Kofi had said. "We remain absolutely still. We make no sound. We give off no sign of life." "It already knows we're here," Priya had said. "It watched us enter." "Knowing is not the same as confirming," Kofi had replied. "The Kikiyaon is attracted to movement, to sound, to the chemical signature of fear. If we can control these things, if we can become dead in every way that matters, there is a chance, however small, that it will lose interest, that it will seek easier prey, that it will leave us long enough for us to reach the stone outpost." "And if it doesn't lose interest?" Tamaz had asked. Kofi had not answered. He had simply pressed himself against the ravine wall, his body becoming a statue, his breathing slowing to a shallow, imperceptible rhythm. And the others, understanding that their survival depended on their ability to emulate the guide's stillness, had done the same. Above them, the Kikiyaon had shifted its position, its talons scraping against the rock with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. It had lowered its head, extending its neck over the edge of the ravine, its pale eyes tracking across the 4 humans with a methodical precision that suggested it was evaluating them, cataloging them, deciding which one to take first. And then, with a suddenness that made them all flinch despite their resolve, the creature had dropped. Not flown. Dropped. It had simply released its grip on the rim and plummeted into the ravine, its wings remaining folded against its body, its talons extended, its beak open. The descent had been controlled, a controlled fall that ended approximately 3 meters from the ravine floor, where the creature had caught itself on an outcropping of rock, its talons gripping the stone with a strength that sent chips of laterite cascading down into the shadows below. It was inside the ravine. Not all the way, its wings still brushed against the walls, and its body was squeezed into a posture that was clearly uncomfortable, its feathers compressed against the stone. But it was inside. Close enough that they could smell it, the stench of rotting snake and old leather filling the confined space with a density that made breathing an act of will. Close enough that they could see the individual barbs on its feathers, the texture of the scales on its legs, the wet sheen of the mucus that coated its beak. And it was looking at them, directly at them, its head swiveled in a motion that was pure owl, pure predator, pure nightmare, and its eyes fixed on each of them in turn. Alina felt the gaze like a physical touch, a pressure against her skin that made her want to scream, to run, to do anything but remain frozen against the wall. Tamaz felt it as a coldness that spread from his chest outward, numbing his limbs, slowing his heartbeat, making his vision blur at the edges. Priya felt it as a seduction, a promise that the fear could end, that the waiting could stop, that all she had to do was step forward and accept the embrace that was being offered. Kofi felt it as recognition, the gaze of a predator that had met this particular prey before, in another forest, in another time, and had been denied its meal by the same strategy that was being employed now. The Kikiyaon remembered him, and the recognition in its pale eyes suggested that it was not angry, not frustrated, but intrigued, challenged, as if the game of hunter and hunted had been elevated by the guide's survival into something more interesting than simple consumption. The creature had extended its beak, opening it slightly, and a sound had emerged. Not the scream that had lured Richard to his death, but something else. A clicking, wet sound like a tongue against teeth, like a door latch being tested, like a key being inserted into a lock. And with the sound had come a smell, not the rot that normally surrounded the creature, but something else, something that was specific and individual. The smell of Richard, the smell of Marcus, the smell of their essences preserved and displayed, offered as evidence of the Kikiyaon's power. "It is tasting us," Kofi had whispered, his lips barely moving, his voice so low that it was more vibration than sound. "Sampling our fear, deciding which of us will be the most flavorful." The Kikiyaon had shifted its weight, its talons scraping against the rock, its body adjusting to the confined space with a flexibility that suggested it was considering whether the squeeze was worth the reward. It had extended one wing, slowly, carefully, pressing the membranous surface against the ravine wall in a gesture that seemed to be testing the space, measuring the angles, calculating whether a strike was possible. And then, with a suddenness that made them all gasp, it had lunged. The beak had snapped forward, closing on empty air less than a meter from Tamaz's face. The journalist had flinched, his body jerking backward against the rock, a whimper escaping his lips before he could clamp his jaw shut. The Kikiyaon had frozen, its head cocked in that unmistakable owl posture of curiosity, and then it had emitted a sound that might have been laughter, a wet, clicking series of notes that suggested amusement, satisfaction, the pleasure of a predator that has confirmed its prey's vulnerability. "It knows," Kofi had breathed. "It knows we will break. It is only waiting to see who breaks first." The creature had settled onto its outcropping, folding its wings with a rustle of feathers and membrane, and it had waited. Its eyes had never left the four survivors, never blinked, never wavered. And in the confined space of the ravine, with the stench of rotting snake filling their lungs and the knowledge of what awaited them burning in their minds, the survivors had understood that their only hope was to outlast the patience of something that had never learned the meaning of impatience. The game had entered its final phase, and the Kikiyaon was in no hurry to end it. Time in the ravine became a liquid, nightmarish thing, stretching and compressing according to the rhythms of the predator's patience and the prey's desperation. The four survivors, Alina, Tamaz, Priya, and Kofi, pressed themselves against the wet stone walls with a stillness that was more than physical. It was a psychological dissolution, a surrender of selfhood that required them to become not people but objects, not living beings but geological features indistinguishable from the rock against which they leaned. The Kikiyaon watched them from its outcropping, its pale eyes unblinking, its beak occasionally opening to emit those wet, clicking sounds that seemed to serve no purpose, but to remind them that it was still there, still interested, still waiting. The creature's proximity was a torture that transcended the physical. It was less than 4 meters away, close enough that Alina could see the individual mites that moved in the feathers around its eyes, close enough that Tamaz could count the serrations on the beak's inner surface, close enough that Priya could observe the way its chest expanded and contracted with each breath, the movement slow and deep, and utterly unlike the rapid respiration of a bird. The Kikiyaon breathed like something mammalian, something reptilian, something that did not fit into any category of biological classification that the survivors possessed. And with each exhalation, it released the smell, that cloying, sulfuric stench of rotting snake that seemed to thicken in the confined space of the ravine until it was a physical presence, a weight that pressed against their faces and filled their lungs with each shallow, terrified breath. "Don't move," Kofi had whispered, the words emerging from his lips as barely perceptible movements of air. "Don't blink, don't swallow, don't let it see you breathe." The guide's advice was anatomically impossible, of course. They had to breathe. Their hearts had to beat. Their bodies had to maintain the metabolic processes that kept them alive, and each of those processes produced signals, thermal, chemical, vibrational, that the Kikiyaon was equipped to detect. But Kofi understood something that the others were only beginning to grasp. The creature was not merely hunting by sensory input. It was hunting by intention. It was reading their fear, their hope, their will to survive, and it was using those psychological signatures to decide when to strike. "Become dead," Kofi had breathed, his eyes closed, his face pressed against the stone in a posture that suggested prayer or submission or both. "In your mind, in your heart, become dead, accept that you are already gone, and in that acceptance find the only freedom that remains." Alina had tried. She had closed her eyes and summoned the memory of Richard's face, not as he had been in the final moments, but as he had been in the early years of their marriage, when they had been young and foolish, and convinced that their love was a fortress against the world's indifference. She had tried to wrap herself in that memory, to use it as a shield against the terror that threatened to dissolve her composure into screaming panic. And for a moment, a brief, fragile moment, she had felt something like peace, something like acceptance, something like the surrender that Kofi was describing. But then the Kikiyaon had shifted its weight, its talons scraping against the rock with a sound like a knife being sharpened, and her eyes had snapped open. Her heart had hammered against her ribs. Her breath had caught in her throat with an audible hitch that was louder than a shout in the silence of the ravine. The creature's head had swiveled toward her, slowly, deliberately. Its pale eyes had fixed on her face with an intensity that made her skin feel as if it were being peeled away, layer by invisible fingers. And it had emitted a sound, a low, harmonic hum that resonated in her sternum and made her teeth ache with sympathetic vibration. The sound was not a threat. It was an inquiry, a question, a taste test. "Alina," Tamaz had whispered, his voice trembling. "Alina, don't look at it." But she couldn't look away. The Kikiyaon's gaze had become a physical force, a gravitational pull that held her eyes locked on its own with a strength that made her neck muscles scream in protest. She had read, in some distant academic past, about the predator-prey stare, the hypnotic effect that certain hunting animals could produce in their victims, a neurological disruption that paralyzed the flight response and left prey waiting, passive, for the killing blow. She had never believed that she would experience it. She had never believed that anything could reduce her, Dr. Alina Vance, Oxford graduate, published author, respected scholar, to a state of quivering, mindless preyhood. And yet here she was, transfixed, hypnotized, waiting. The Kikiyaon had extended its beak, opening it slightly, and the harmonic hum had intensified. Alina had felt something then, something that was not physical but was more real than any physical sensation could have been. It was as if the creature were reaching into her somehow, bypassing skin and muscle and bone to touch the thing that made her Alina, the essence that existed somewhere between her memories and her aspirations, her regrets and her hopes. The touch was cold, impersonal, clinical, the examination of a specimen by a collector who was deciding whether to add it to the collection. "No," she had whispered, and the word had been so small, so fragile, that it was barely audible even to her own ears. But the Kikiyaon had heard, or sensed, or understood, and its response had been immediate and terrifying. The creature had lunged, not at a leaner but at the space directly in front of her face, its beak snapping shut with a sound like a gunshot, the air displacement from the strike ruffling her hair and making her flinch backward against the rock. It had not been trying to kill her. It had been testing her, probing her defenses, confirming that she was still alive, still afraid, still worth the effort of collection. The lunge had broken the spell. Elinor had gasped, her hands coming up to cover her face, her body sliding down the wall until she was crouched on the ravine floor, her knees drawn up to her chest, her breath coming in ragged sobs that she could not control. "I can't," she had whimpered. "I can't do this, I can't." "The outpost," Kofi had said, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through her panic with a command tone that demanded obedience. "We need to move, now, while it is assessing, while it is deciding." "It will see us," Priya had said, her own composure cracking under the pressure of Elinor's breakdown. "It will hear us, it will. It already sees us, it already hears us. The only question is whether it can reach us before we reach the outpost." Kofi had pointed down the ravine toward a point where the walls seemed to narrow further before opening again into a wider section. 300 meters. The stone outpost is in the wider section, built by the Germans in the colonial era. Iron doors. Stone walls half a meter thick, if we can reach it, if we can barricade ourselves inside. 300 meters, Tamaz had repeated, his eyes darting between the Kikiyaon and the distant promise of safety. "In the open, while that thing watches us." "Yes. That's insane." "Yes." Kofi had straightened, his body unfolding from its pressed position against the wall with a deliberation that suggested he was preparing to run for his life and was determined to do it with dignity. "But insanity is the only option that remains. Stay here and it will take you one by one. Run and it might miss." "Might," Priya had echoed, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Might is more than we have any right to expect." Kofi had looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering longest on Elinor, who was still crouched on the floor, her body shaking with uncontrollable tremors. "On my signal, not before. We run together, we do not scatter. The outpost has 2 doors, front and rear. We enter through the front, we barricade both, and then we pray." "To what?" Tamaz had asked. "To anything that listens." The Kikiyaon had shifted again, its head tilting in that unmistakable posture of curiosity, its eyes tracking Kofi's movements with a focus that suggested it knew something was about to happen. The creature was not stupid. It was not merely a beast driven by instinct. It was a strategist, a planner, a predator that had evolved over millennia to understand the psychology of its prey. And it understood with absolute certainty that the prey was about to run. "Now," Kofi had said, and the word had been the starting gun, the detonator, the point of no return. They had run. 4 humans bursting from their positions against the ravine wall with a violence that suggested explosion rather than movement. Elinor had been slowest, her shock-dissolved coordination making her movements clumsy and uncertain, but Tamaz had grabbed her arm, hauling her forward with a strength that surprised them both. Priya had sprinted ahead, her yoga-honed flexibility allowing her to navigate the uneven terrain with a grace that was almost beautiful in its desperation. Kofi had brought up the rear, his older legs pumping with a determination that spoke of survival instinct honed by decades of living in a world where death was not an abstraction, but a constant companion. The Kikiyaon had not been surprised. It had launched itself from its outcropping with a speed that made its previous stillness seem like a deception, a strategy designed to lull them into the false belief that it was ponderous, slow, manageable. Its wings had snapped open with a sound like sails catching wind, the 20-foot span filling the ravine with shadow and pressure, and it had ascended in a steep climb that carried it above the ravine walls in less than 2 seconds. Then it had turned. The dive was a thing of terrible beauty, a controlled plummet that suggested not gravity but intention, not falling but choosing to descend. The Kikiyaon had folded its wings at the last moment, becoming a streamlined projectile of feather and bone, and it had dropped into the ravine behind the fleeing humans with a precision that was surgical in its accuracy. Its talons had extended, its shoulder spurs had gleamed, and its beak had opened in a soundless scream of predatory focus. "Faster!" Kofi had screamed, though his voice was barely audible above the thunder of wings and the pounding of blood in their ears. Tamaz had been pulling Alina, dragging her forward with a grip that was leaving bruises on her upper arm, when the downdraft had struck them from behind. It was not the gentle pressure of before. It was a wall of displaced air that slammed into their backs with the force of a truck, lifting them from their feet and hurling them forward in a tangle of limbs and momentum. They had struck the ravine floor together, rolling across the sharp stones in a confusion of pain and disorientation, and when Tamaz had looked up, he had seen the Kikiyaon rising from its dive, climbing back toward the rim with a grace that mocked their desperate scramble. "It's hurting us," Priya had gasped, already back on her feet, her hand extended to help Alina rise. "It's not trying to kill us yet, it's pushing us, controlling our direction." She was right. The Kikiyaon's dives were not aimed at killing. They were aimed at channeling, directing, forcing the survivors along the path that the creature had chosen. Each downdraft struck at a specific angle, each wingbeat created a pressure wave that nudged them left or right, and the cumulative effect was a funneling toward the wider section of the ravine where the stone outpost waited. "Why?" Alina had moaned, her ankle throbbing from the fall, her hands bloody from the stones. "Why doesn't it just take us?" "Because the outpost is part of the game," Kofi had said, his face a mask of terrible understanding. "The Kikiyaon knows about the outpost. It has known about it for years, and it wants us to reach it. It wants us to believe we are safe, because the moment we believe we are safe is the moment when the fear is sweetest, the moment when the hope is most intense, the moment when the essence is most flavorful." "Then we don't go to the outpost," Tamaz had said. "We go anywhere else." "There is no anywhere else." Kofi had gestured at the ravine walls, at the sheer cliffs that rose on either side, at the darkness that lay behind them and the open sky that lay above. "The Kikiyaon controls the heights. It controls the exits. The outpost is the only structure within kilometers that offers any protection at all, and if we do not reach it, we die here, in the open, with no hope at all." They had run again. The outpost was visible now, a gray block of stone that emerged from the ravine wall like a fossilized organ in the body of the earth. It was small, perhaps 6 meters square, 2 stories tall, but its walls were massive, constructed from volcanic rock and reinforced with iron bands that had been forged in European foundries and shipped to Africa in the holds of colonial steamers. The doors were iron, dark with rust but still solid, still heavy, still capable of withstanding forces that would splinter modern construction. 200 meters, 150, 100. The Kikiyaon had made its move. It had not dived this time. It had simply dropped, folding its wings and falling like a stone from the rim of the ravine, landing with a force that made the ground shake and sent a spray of dust and pebbles cascading across the ravine floor. It had landed between the survivors and the outpost, its body blocking the path with a mass that seemed to fill the entire width of the ravine. Its wings had unfolded slowly, stretching from wall to wall in a gesture that suggested not aggression but possession. This space was claimed. This prey was claimed, and the time for waiting was over. "Go around," Kofi had screamed, but there was no around. The creature's wingspan blocked the ravine completely, and its body was low to the ground, its talons gripping the stone with a strength that suggested it could maintain this position indefinitely. "The wall," Tamaz had shouted, pointing to a section of the ravine where a geological fault had created a series of natural steps that led upward toward a ledge approximately 4 meters above the floor. "Climb. Go over." He had been the first to move, sprinting toward the steps with a speed that suggested he had already accepted that he was going to die, and was determined to do it on his feet rather than his knees. Alina had followed, her injured ankle screaming in protest, her hands finding purchase on the rough stone with a desperation that made her fingers bleed. Priya had been behind her, and Kofi behind Priya, the guide positioning himself to shield the others from whatever might come. The Kikiyaon had watched them climb with an expression that might have been amusement. It had not moved to intercept them. It had simply waited, its head tracking their progress, its beak clicking in that wet, rhythmic pattern that suggested satisfaction. Because it knew. It knew that the ledge was a dead end. It knew that the climb would exhaust them. It knew that the moment they reached the top, they would discover that there was nowhere else to go. Tamaz had reached the ledge first, hauling himself onto the narrow shelf of stone with a grunt of effort. He had turned to help Alina, his hand extended, his fingers brushing hers in the instant before the shadow fell. The Kikiyaon had not climbed. It had not needed to. It had simply extended its neck, that impossible neck that seemed to contain more vertebrae than any bird should possess, and its beak had snapped closed around Tamaz's ankle with a precision that was gentle and terrible in equal measure. The journalist had been lifted from the ledge as easily as a child lifts a doll, his body suspended upside down in the creature's grip. His scream, that final human scream, cut short by the same harmonic vibration that had consumed Marcus, the same emptying, the same extraction of essence. His body had hung limp, swinging gently from the Kikiyaon's beak like a macabre pendulum. His eyes had been open, staring, empty. The thing that had been Tamaz Herrera, the collector of experiences, the architect of extreme moments, the man who had filled leather-bound journals with the stories of his adventures, that thing was gone, consumed, added to the collection. Tamaz! Alina's scream had been pure grief, pure horror, pure animal denial of what her eyes were telling her. She had lunged toward the creature, her hands clawing at empty air, her mind dissolved into a red haze of rage and despair. "No," Kofi had grabbed her, his arms wrapping around her waist, hauling her back from the edge with a strength that belied his age. "No, it wants this. It wants you to react, to feel, to despair." "Let me go," Alina had shrieked, her fists pounding against his chest, her tears hot and bitter on her cheeks. "Let me go, I don't care, I don't want to live, not without them, not without." "You want to live," Kofi had said, his voice calm and certain in the midst of her chaos. "You want to live because that is what humans do. That is what the Kikiyaon cannot understand. That is the one thing that makes you stronger than it is." The creature had dropped Tamaz's body. It had fallen to the ravine floor with a wet thud, landing in a heap of limbs that was already beginning to cool, already beginning the slow transition from person to object. And the Kikiyaon had turned its attention back to the survivors, its pale eyes fixed on Alina with an intensity that suggested it had found what it was looking for, had identified the prey whose fear was richest, whose essence was most potent, whose collection would be the crown jewel of its hoard. "The outpost," Kofi had whispered, his hand finding Alina's, his fingers interlacing with hers in a gesture of solidarity that was also a preparation for the final sprint. "Priya, Alina, we run, now together, and we do not look back." They had run. 3 survivors now, reduced from 6 by half, their numbers diminishing with each encounter, their hope diminishing with each loss. But they had run with a desperation that transcended hope, a primal survival instinct that operated below the level of conscious decision, below the level of fear, below the level of grief. They had run because running was the only thing left to do, and stopping meant joining Richard and Marcus and Tamaz in the Kikiyaon's collection. The creature had let them go. Or rather, It had allowed them to pass, withdrawing its wings from the ravine floor with a slow, deliberate motion that created a narrow corridor between its body and the wall. It had stepped aside, its talons scraping against the stone, its head lowered in a posture that might have been bowing, might have been mockery, might have been the patient anticipation of a collector who knows that the best specimens are those who believe they have escaped. Alina and Priya and Kofi had sprinted past it, their bodies brushing against its feathers, their nostrils filling with the stench of rotting snake, their minds screaming with the awareness of how close they were to death, how easily the creature could reach out and take them, how completely they were at its mercy. But the Kikiyaon had not reached out. It had simply watched them pass, its eyes tracking their movement with a focus that suggested not hunger but appraisal, not predation but planning. The outpost doors had loomed before them, massive iron slabs that hung on hinges the size of a man's forearm. Kofi had reached them first, his hands finding the heavy iron ring that served as a handle, his muscles straining against the weight of decades of rust and corrosion. The door had opened with a shriek of metal against stone, the sound like a scream in the silence of the ravine, and he had shoved Alina through, then Priya, then himself. They had turned, as one, to slam the door shut, and in that moment they had seen the Kikiyaon. It was coming, not flying, running, moving along the ravine floor with a speed that was terrifying in its earthbound intensity, its wings folded against its body, its talons throwing sparks from the stone, its shoulder spurs extended like blades aimed directly at their hearts. The creature had dropped the pretense of hurting, had abandoned the game of patience, and was now moving to end the hunt with a directness that suggested either urgency or excitement, or both. "Close it," Priya had screamed, her shoulder slamming against the iron slab, her feet braced against the stone floor. Alina had thrown her weight against the door, her hands gripping the iron ring with fingers that had gone numb from terror. Kofi had joined them, his body pressing against the metal, his legs driving with a strength that was more than physical. It was the strength of a man who refused to die, who refused to be collected, who refused to become another specimen in the Kikiyaon's horde. The door had closed with a sound like thunder, the iron edge meeting the stone frame with a force that sent vibrations through their bodies. And a fraction of a second later, the creature had struck. The impact had been immense, a collision of flesh and metal that made the outpost walls shake and sent dust cascading from the ceiling in a rain of ancient particles. The iron door had buckled slightly, bowing inward under the force of the Kikiyaon's charge, and through the gap between door and frame, they had seen the shoulder spur, its monomolecular edge scraping against the metal with a sound like fingernails on a blackboard amplified to the volume of a jet engine. The spur had left a groove in the iron, a deep scar that testified to the impossible sharpness of the creature's weapons, and then it had withdrawn, the scraping sound fading as the Kikiyaon pulled back for another attempt. "The bar," Kofi had shouted, pointing to a heavy wooden beam that lay in the corner of the outpost's interior, a relic of colonial engineering, rough-hewn and massive, designed to secure the door against forces that the builders had probably never imagined. "Help me." They had lifted the beam together, 3 survivors straining against the weight of solid oak, and had dropped it into the iron brackets that spanned the door's width. The beam had settled with a finality that was almost comforting, a mechanical assurance that suggested the door would hold, that the walls would hold, that they were safe. For now. The second impact had come seconds after the bar was in place, and it had been weaker than the first, as if the Kikiyaon had tested the door's resistance and found it sufficient. The scraping of the shoulder spur against the iron had continued for a long moment, a sound like a knife being drawn across a wet stone, rhythmic and patient and utterly terrifying, and then it had stopped. Silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence. The silence of something waiting. The silence of a predator that has all the time in the world and knows that its prey has nowhere else to go. They had sat in the darkness of the outpost, their backs against the wall, their bodies shaking with the aftereffects of adrenaline and exhaustion, and they had listened. To the silence, to the darkness, to the sound of their own breathing, which seemed impossibly loud in the confined space, impossibly revealing, impossibly dangerous. "It will wait," Kofi had said, his voice barely audible. "It knows we cannot stay here forever. The outpost has no food, no water, no other exit. Eventually we will have to leave, and when we do, it will be there." Elinor had finished, her voice hollow. Yes. They had passed the night in a state that was neither sleep nor wakefulness, a suspended animation of terror and exhaustion that left them more drained than any rest could have repaired. Priya had sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes fixed on the door, her body trembling with a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Elinor had lain on the stone floor, her face turned toward the wall, her mind replaying the moments of Richard's death, of Tomas's consumption, of Marcus's emptying with a compulsive repetition that suggested trauma settling into permanence. Kofi had sat apart from them, his face in his hands, his body rocking slightly in a motion that suggested prayer or madness or both. The morning had come with a slowness that was almost cruel, the light filtering through gaps in the stonework in pale shafts that illuminated the dust motes and did nothing to dispel the darkness in their hearts. And with the morning had come the sound of voices. "Hello," a man's voice, distant but clear. "Is anyone there? We are from the village. We heard the noises. We have come to help." Kofi had risen slowly, his body stiff from the night's immobility, his eyes suspicious. "How do we know you are human?" he had called out, his voice cracked from dehydration and fear. A pause, then laughter, warm, human, unmistakably genuine. "Because the Kikiyaon does not laugh, old friend, and because we have brought water and food and strong backs to carry you home." The door had been unbarred with trembling hands, and the light of day had flooded into the outpost with an intensity that made them squint and shield their eyes. Outside, a party of 6 men from the nearest village had stood with expressions of concern and pity, their eyes taking in the survivors' bedraggled state with the weary recognition of people who had seen this before, who had rescued others before, who knew the signs of an encounter with the Kikiyaon as well as they knew the signs of malaria or snakebite. They had been led back to the village, a journey of 3 hours through terrain that seemed impossibly benign in the daylight, impossibly normal, impossibly indifferent to the horrors that had unfolded in its shadows. The villagers had asked no questions, had demanded no explanations, had simply provided water and food and a place to rest, their silence more eloquent than any interrogation could have been. Elinor had sat in the village's communal shelter, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of wood smoke and unfamiliar spices, and she had stared at the fire that burned in the center of the space. The flames had danced and flickered, creating patterns of light and shadow that reminded her, with a pang of grief that was almost physical, of the fire that she and Richard had built on their first night in the forest, when the world had still been a place of adventure and possibility, before the smell had come and everything had changed. "You are lucky," an old woman had said, settling beside her with a bowl of something hot and savory. "The Kikiyaon does not always let survivors go. Usually when it hunts it takes all. The fact that you are here, it means something." "What does it mean?" Elinor had asked, her voice barely audible. The old woman had looked at her with eyes that were clouded with cataracts but sharp with a knowledge that transcended physical vision. "It means you are marked. It means the Kikiyaon has tasted your fear and found it interesting. It means it will remember you. And it means that one day, when you have forgotten the smell and the sounds and the feeling of its eyes on your skin, it will come for you again. Not in the forest, not in the darkness, but in the moment when you believe you are safe. The moment when you think the danger is behind you. That is when the Kikiyaon strikes, not when you are prepared, but when you are at peace." Elinor had not slept that night. She had sat by the fire until the flames had died to embers, and then she had walked to the edge of the village, staring out into the darkness of the forest that began where the cultivated fields ended. The jungle had been silent, dark, impenetrable, but she had known with a certainty that needed no evidence that something was watching her from the canopy, something pale-eyed and patient, something that smelled of rotting snake and old leather. The rescue had come the next morning, a government vehicle dispatched from the regional capital to retrieve the survivors and transport them back to the city. Elinor had climbed into the vehicle with a stiffness that suggested her body had forgotten how to move normally, how to exist in a world where the primary concern was not immediate death. Priya had sat beside her, staring out the window with an expression of emptiness that suggested her mind was still in the ravine, still pressed against the wall, still waiting for the Kikiyaon to make its move. Kofi had not come with them. He had stood at the edge of the village, his face turned toward the forest, and he had raised one hand in a gesture of farewell that was also, Elinor had understood, a gesture of warning. He would return to the forest. He would continue to guide. He would continue to warn. And one day, she knew, he would encounter the Kikiyaon again, and the creature would remember him, and the game would continue until one of them was finally, irrevocably, collected. The vehicle had bumped along the dirt road, carrying them away from the village, away from the forest, away from the nightmare that had consumed 3 members of their expedition, and marked the survivors for a fate that was merely postponed rather than escaped. Elinor had leaned her head against the window, her eyes closed, her mind drifting toward a sleep that she knew would be haunted by pale eyes and the sound of wings. And then she had smelled it. It was faint at first, so subtle that she thought she was imagining it, a phantom of trauma that her mind had conjured from the darkness of memory. But as the vehicle continued along the road, the smell had intensified, becoming unmistakable, undeniable. The cloying, sulfuric stench of rotting snake, the sweet corruption of bloated python, the signature scent of the Kikiyaon. She had looked down at her clothes, at the hiking pants and technical shirt that she had worn since the expedition began, that she had sweated in and bled in and vomited in during the hours of terror. And she had understood, with a clarity that made her stomach heave with nausea, that the smell was not coming from the forest. It was not coming from the road. It was not coming from any external source. It was coming from her. The Kikiyaon had marked her. In the moment of its closest approach, when its feathers had brushed against her arm and its breath had washed across her face, it had deposited something on her skin, in her pores, in her hair. A chemical signature, a tracking scent, a beacon that would allow it to find her wherever she went, across whatever distance, through whatever barrier. She had lifted her arm to her nose, inhaling deeply, and the smell had been there, unmistakable, unmistakably hers. Old leather and rotting meat and something else, something that smelled like fear distilled into its purest, most concentrated form. "No," she had whispered, her eyes wide, her body rigid. "No, no, no." Priya had looked at her, puzzled. "Elinor, what's wrong?" "The smell," Elinor had said, her voice trembling. "Can't you smell it?" Priya had sniffed, her nostrils flaring, and her expression had shifted from confusion to alarm to a recognition that mirrored Elinor's own. "Oh God," Priya had breathed. "Oh God, it's on me too. I can smell it. It's on my clothes, my skin. It's inside me." They had looked at each other then, 2 survivors in a vehicle carrying them away from a nightmare that had not ended, that would never end, that had simply changed its nature from immediate threat to patient pursuit. The Kikiyaon had marked them. The Kikiyaon was following them. Not in the forest, perhaps, not in the daylight, but in the darkness, in the quiet moments, in the instant when they finally believed they were safe, when the memory had faded enough to allow sleep, when the scent of the city had replaced the scent of the jungle in their conscious minds. That was when it would come. That was when the pale eyes would appear at the window, when the wings would block out the moonlight, when the beak would open, and the harmonic hum would begin the process of emptying, of collecting, of adding 2 more specimens to a horde that spanned centuries and continents. Elinor had pressed her face against the window, staring out at the passing landscape with eyes that were dry and wide and empty. The forest was behind them now, reduced to a green blur on the horizon. The city was ahead, with its lights and its noise and its comforting illusion of civilization. And somewhere in the space between, in the shadows of the trees, in the darkness beneath the bridges, in the stillness of the night, the Kikiyaon was following. She could smell it. She would always smell it. The scent of old leather and rotting snake and the accumulated fear of a creature that had never been hunted, never been defeated, never been denied the collection that was its right and its purpose and its eternal, patient obsession. The vehicle had continued along the road, carrying them toward a safety that was no longer safe, toward a future that was merely a postponement, toward a life that would be defined not by the days that passed but by the moment, the inevitable, inescapable moment, when the smell would intensify, when the shadows would deepen, when the pale eyes would finally appear in the darkness of her bedroom, and the Kikiyaon would reach out with its beak and its talons and its infinite, consuming patience, and take what had been marked as its own. Elinor had closed her eyes then, and she had wept. Not for Richard, though she wept for him too. Not for Marcus or Tamaz, though their losses were wounds that would never heal. She had wept for herself, for Priya, for the survivors who were not survivors at all but merely prey that had been released for a time, prey that would be collected when the hunt resumed, when the patience ran out, when the Kikiyaon decided that the game had gone on long enough. The vehicle had carried her away from the forest, but the forest had not released her, and the creature that ruled the forest, the owl that was not an owl, the collector of breath, the thing that left the body but took the soul, had not forgotten her. It was only waiting. And the smell was the only warning she would get. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.